The perfume was called Nuit d'Avis, and for more than 30 years in a certain set of rooms in a certain part of the capital, it was the one scent no woman of the court ever wore, not because it was unpleasant. On the contrary, it was a very fine scent, made by an old house in the Rue Saint-Léon, a sharp green opening that softened into something warmer and more particular, a faint suggestion of crushed bay leaf and the inside of a cedar wardrobe, the kind of perfume a clever woman wears when she does not wish to be remembered for her perfume and ends, of course, by being remembered for nothing else. It was sold openly. Any woman in Estavia might have bought it, and in the houses of the bourgeoisie and the country gentry it was bought, and worn and admired, and gave no one any trouble at all. But not at court, not in the rooms the Queen passed through. There, by an unwritten understanding so complete that no one could have told you who had laid it down, or Nuit d'Estavie was the one bottle no lady-in-waiting ever owned, no visiting wife ever applied before an audience, no debutante's mother ever permitted in her daughter's case for the season. The reason was not stated, the reason did not need to be. Everyone in those rooms knew it the way one knows the colour of one's own front door, knew it so thoroughly that the knowing had stopped feeling like a secret and become simply a fact of the air, of the dressing tables, of the small daily choices a courtier made before going up. Not that one, not today, not ever, not in any room Her Majesty might enter, because Nuit d'Estavie was the perfume the Prince Consort's women wore, every one of them, across 30 years, and the Queen could smell it at 12 paces, and there were not many things in the world the Queen of Estavia could not be required to endure. But the scent of her husband's lovers, in her own private apartments, was by a kind of universal silent treaty one of them. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. This is the kind of story Estavia produced, not a scandal exactly. Scandals are loud, scandals are printed. This was the other thing. The thing that ran underneath the kingdom for the whole length of a reign, the open secret, the worst kept confidence at any court in Europe, and somehow, by a feat of collective discretion that would have astonished a foreigner, if a foreigner had ever been told of it, never quite breaking the surface of the public water. The newspapers did not print it. The court did not speak of it. The Queen did not, in any room any servant ever entered, acknowledge it. And yet everyone, from the senior ambassador down to the boot boy at the side gate, knew it, in the particular complete way one knows an unwritten thing, and lived their days around it, and adjusted their perfumes and their gossip and their seating plans accordingly. And the whole machinery of the court ran on the assumption that what was happening was not happening, which was, in the end, the most exhausting and intricate kind of work a great household ever has to do. Far harder than concealing a thing the public does not yet know, because the work of pretending a known thing is unknown requires the cooperation of every soul in the building, every minute, for years, and one careless word from any of them anywhere brings the whole construction down, and the construction in Estavia did not come down, not once, not in 30 years, and that is itself a kind of monument, though not a kind anyone wished to claim credit for, and we are going to look at how it was built, and at what it cost the people who built it, and at the women whose perfume could not be worn in the Queen's rooms, and at the Queen herself, who stood at the centre of all of it with a composure that the kingdom mistook for the whole of those 30 years, for ignorance, and that was not ignorance, never had been. And that is the first thing the official memory of that reign got wrong, and the first thing this telling means to correct. The Prince Consort was Prince Auguste of Westmark-Linden, who married the young Queen Sophia in the autumn of 1953, and who was, by every contemporary account, the handsomest man in any room he entered for the next 40 years, and who knew it, and who acted upon the knowledge with an energy that the kingdom found, in the first years, dashing, in the middle years, regrettable, and in the late years, by a kind of weary collective indulgence, simply a fact of him, the way some men are tall and some men are short, and Prince Auguste was unfaithful, and there was, the consensus seemed to settle, no more point in being scandalized by it than by his height. He was funny, in the way charming, difficult men are funny, with a sharp tongue that the press loved, and that the Foreign Service had occasionally to clean up after. He was clever in flashes and bored in long stretches, and he had been married, the foreign cousins said behind their hands, slightly above his station, to a kingdom whose constitution would never let him do the things he might have been good at, and whose queen would, with great kindness and great firmness, never let him forget it. Whether the women began as a consolation for the boredom, or whether the boredom was simply the surface he gave to a temperament that would have produced the women in any circumstances, the people who watched him longest could never quite decide. The young footman who saw him passing the small hours in the corridors of country houses, where he was not, strictly, a guest of the room he was emerging from, the ladies-in-waiting who learned to recognize the particular set of his shoulders that meant he had been somewhere he should not have been, the equerries who arranged the discreet motor cars and the discreet country weekends and the discreet returns, none of them, in the end, cared what the cause was. They only knew the effect, and the effect was their work, the perpetual quiet labor of keeping the open secret open in private and closed in public, and the unwritten rule about nuit d'Estavia, and the seating plans, and the carefully managed photographs, and the silences that upped around certain names so reliably that to mention one of those names at court was, by the late 1960s, the social equivalent of breaking a glass on a polished floor. The room did not chastise you. The room simply, instantly, altogether, pretended you had not done it and went on, and you did not after that get asked back. The women themselves are the part of the story that has been least told, and that this telling will spend the most time on, because they were real women, not the silhouettes the gossip allowed them to be, not the Augusta's woman of the courtier's shorthand, not the figure in the doorway of a country house. At 3 in the morning the footman pretended not to see. They had names. They had lives before him, and lives during him, and lives after him, and the lives after in particular were almost always the worst part, were what the open secret cost them. Not him, never him. He paid almost nothing in any currency that mattered. The cost was always paid by them and by the Queen, and by the quiet army of servants who made the pretense possible. And we will count those costs honestly, because no one at the time was permitted to count them. And the women themselves, the ones still living, will not now, and the Queen most certainly never did. And that leaves the counting to this telling, the way such countings are always left, late, to someone outside, who can do the arithmetic the people inside were forbidden to do. There was the singer, in the early years, before the children were born, who paid for the affair with her career and went home to a small house in a Mediterranean town to teach music to children whose mothers, when she was out of the room, told them in lowered voices who their teacher had once been to. There was the ambassador's wife in the middle period, whose husband knew and whose government required him to know nothing, and whose marriage survived intact, on paper, for the remaining 30 years of his service, and was a marriage of 2 strangers sleeping in adjacent bedrooms for the whole of it, both of them paying every night for what one of them had done in a country house weekend in 1964. There was the much younger woman in the late years, who was perhaps not even an affair in the strictest sense, but who was treated as one by the court, for the simple reason that the court no longer knew how to treat any woman seen alone with the prince consort as anything else, and who was destroyed by the assumption almost more thoroughly than the actual women were destroyed by the act, because the actual women had at least had the thing, had at least known what they were paying for, while she paid the same price for nothing, for a misunderstanding the court refused to correct, because correcting it would have admitted the larger pattern, and so an innocent woman walked out of Estavia, carrying the reputation of a guilty one, because the kingdom's silence required no distinction to be made. And there was the Queen. There was, before anyone else, and after everyone else, and underneath the whole 30 years of the thing, Queen Sophia, who knew everything, from the second year, in detail, by name, and who never said a word, and who held a court that bowed to her every morning, while her husband's women's perfume hung faintly in the back stairs, and who did this not, as her people half imagined, out of patience or out of love, or out of the particular weakness royal wives are sometimes credited with, but out of a clear-eyed political calculation she made in the second year of her marriage at the age of 24, and held to, with a discipline that would have done credit to any general in the kingdom's history, for the next 38 years, and the nature of that calculation, and what it cost her to keep it, and the one moment in all those decades when she came within a single breath of breaking it, are the deepest substance of this story, and have never been told, and are told now from the only source that ever knew the whole of them, which was a woman who served the Queen for 44 years, who was at her shoulder at the precise moment in 1971, when the breath was nearly taken and was not, and who lived to be very old, and who finally, on the condition that she be dead before a word of it appeared, set the whole of it down in a manuscript she gave to her granddaughter on her 90th birthday, and asked to be published, "Only when I am gone, child, and not before, because I have kept this for 50 years, and I am not minded, at the end, to keep it for nothing, but neither am I minded of the people in those rooms who are still living, and so we will let me die first, and then you will tell it all, and that is what I want for what I leave you, the truth of those years, told finally, in plain words, after a lifetime of having to call it by other names." Her name was Madeleine Vaury. She was 22 when she joined the court in 1957, the youngest of 3 sisters from a respectable provincial family, with a quick mind and a discreet face and a habit which would prove the central professional skill of her life, of being able to remember everything and recount almost none of it. She was assigned to the Queen as a junior lady-in-waiting in the spring of 1959, 6 years into the marriage, 2 children in, and she would still be at the Queen's side, white-haired now, on the afternoon in 1997 when Queen Sophia died at 71 of a stroke in a sunlit room, and in all the 44 years between those 2 dates, Madeleine Vaury would say nothing to anyone of what she saw, and would write everything down in private, in a series of notebooks she kept locked in a wardrobe in the country house her family had owned for 2 centuries, and would, at 90, with hands that shook so badly her granddaughter had to take dictation for the last chapters, give the world the only honest account it would ever have of the reign of Sophia of Estavia, and the man she married, and the women he loved, and the silence the kingdom built around the whole arrangement, and the cost of that silence, paid in full by the people who built it, including the Queen at its centre, including the singer in the Mediterranean town, including the ambassador's wife in the Marriage of Strangers, including the innocent young woman destroyed for nothing, including Madeleine Vaury herself, whose own quiet life, this telling will eventually have to acknowledge, was its own kind of cost, the cost of being the one who keeps the count, the woman who could not have her own loves, because she was always in the room watching someone else's not work, who arrived at 90 with the manuscript, and no one beside her, but the granddaughter she was dictating it to, and who said, on the last afternoon of the dictation, the line her granddaughter would later place at the very end of the published book, and that we will end this hook with, because it is the truest single sentence anyone ever produced about the whole long glittering ruinous open secret of that reign. We all knew that was the worst of it. Not the not knowing, which would have been a kind of innocence. The knowing, every one of us, every day, for 30 years and saying nothing. A whole kingdom of people walking around a fire and agreeing, without ever speaking of it, that there was no fire, while the smoke got into our clothes and our hair and our children and our marriages and the very curtains of the rooms we lived in, and we breathed it for 30 years and pretended we were breathing ordinary air. And when at last the fire went out, because the man who lit it was old and tired, and the world had changed around him, we found that we had become, all of us, a little burnt at the edges, everyone, and that this burning was the true history of the reign, and that no historian would ever write it, and that I would have to. And so, child, take this down, and let me say at last, in plain words, what we spent our lives saying in other ones. There was a fire. There was always a fire, we all knew, and we said nothing, and here finally is what it cost. Madeleine Vaury came to court in the autumn of 1957, 4 years into the reign, and what she remembered most clearly afterward, more clearly than the gilt and the uniforms and the strange echoing largeness of the rooms, was that no one would tell her anything. Not in the cold sense, the way servants are kept ignorant in lesser houses. The court of Estavia was, on the contrary, a place of constant elaborate talk. There was talk through every meal, talk in every corridor between duties, talk in the small antechambers, where the ladies-in-waiting waited, and the equerries waited, and everyone waited a great deal of the time for the principals to need something. And Madeleine, a quick girl who had grown up the youngest of three clever sisters at a provincial dinner table, was used to talk, good at it, and prepared to be entertained. What she was not prepared for was the discovery, within a fortnight, that the talk of the court was not what it appeared to be, that beneath its surface, beneath the gossip about the riding accident and the visiting ambassador and the new hat the Duchess of Solac had worn to the opera, there ran a second conversation, a conversation conducted entirely in pauses and lifted eyebrows and sentences that stopped before they finished, and that the second conversation was the real one, and that she had not yet been admitted to it, and that until she was, the first conversation, the one she was permitted to hear, would not make sense, because all its references and most of its punchlines belonged to the second. She felt it most sharply on her third evening at the supper for the junior household, when an older lady-in-waiting, a Madame Charpentier whom Madeleine would in time come to regard as her single most reliable teacher in the matter of what could be said and what could not, told a long anecdote about a country house weekend the previous summer, with great wit and considerable detail, and ended it with the line, "And of course we all knew where the prince had been until 4, and the table laughed, and Madeleine laughed too, because the laughter was clearly required, and then realized, half a second later, with a small cold prickle at the back of her neck, that she had no idea where the prince had been until 4, and that the joke, whatever it was, depended on her knowing, and that no one was going to tell her, and that the laughing along without knowing was itself a kind of test, and one she had, by laughing, just passed, because the next morning Madame Charpentier sought her out with a small approving nod and said only, 'You'll do, Mademoiselle Vaury, you've the right reflex, the rest you'll pick up in time.' The reflex, that was the word Madame Charpentier used for it, that first month, the only thing she ever named directly, and Madeleine would think about that word for the rest of her life, because it was the most precise term she ever heard for the entire skill the court ran on. The reflex, not knowledge, not training, not even discretion, exactly. A reflex, the way a dancer has a reflex, the way a soldier has a reflex, an instant trained deep response that worked faster than thought, that produced the right face and the right laugh and the right closed mouth before the mind had even finished registering what the situation was. The court did not teach you the secrets. The court taught you to behave correctly around the shape of secrets you had not yet been told, to laugh at the right moment about the thing you did not know, to fall silent at the right moment about the thing you did not know, to keep your face as if you knew when you did not know, and as if you did not know when you did, so that by the time you finally understood, 6 months in, 12 months in, 2 years as in, what the second conversation had been about all along, you had been performing it correctly the whole time. You had become a fluent native speaker of a language you had not yet been given the dictionary to, and the dictionary, when it finally arrived, did not change your behavior at all, only your understanding of why your behavior had been correct. That was the cleverness of the place. By the time the truth was permitted to reach you, you had already been protecting it for months without knowing what it was. Madeleine learned to laugh without knowing through the autumn and the winter of 1957, and through the spring and summer of 1958, and by the autumn of 1958, after a year and some months at court, she understood what the second conversation was about, and she could not have told you exactly when she had understood it, because the understanding did not arrive. The understanding accumulated, the way certain kinds of weather accumulate, a degree at a time, until you find yourself one morning in a season you cannot date the beginning of. She understood that the prince consort had women. She understood that the queen knew. She understood that the entire household knew that the queen knew. She understood that no one would ever, under any circumstances, say so, and that her job, the deep substance of her job, beneath the official duties of the inventory and the wardrobe and the correspondence, was to participate in the not saying, perfectly, every day, for as long as she remained at court, which her family hoped would be until a suitable marriage was arranged, and which she found, with a small private surprise, she was beginning to hope would be considerably longer than that, because Madeleine Vaury, the provincial girl with the discreet face, had discovered in herself, in those first 18 months, a talent for the reflex that frightened her a little, the way any real talent frightens its possessor at first, and that the court had recognized before she had, and that was the reason. She now understood that she was assigned in the spring of 1959, when she was 23 years old and had been on her first posting only a year and a half, to the personal household of the Queen. It was an unusual promotion. The Queen's ladies were older, mostly settled women, the wives and widows of senior men, chosen for steadiness and connection rather than youth. Madeleine was none of those things. She was unmarried. She had no rank to speak of. She was, by the standards of the appointment, a child. The promotion was made by Madame Charpentier, who was by then mistress of the Queen's household, and who explained it to Madeleine in a single private conversation in a small green room at the back of the palace that Madeleine would remember in detail for the rest of her life, because it was, she would understand later, her actual induction into the court, the moment at which the second conversation was finally, officially, opened unto her. "You have been with us nearly 2 years," Madame Charpentier said. She was a woman of perhaps 55, plain-faced, with eyes that gave very little. "In that time you have committed no error of the reflex that I am aware of, which is remarkable. You laughed at the Prince matter at your first supper. Do you remember that?" "I remember, madame. I had no idea what I was laughing at." "I know. That was the point. Anyone can laugh when they know. The talent is to laugh when you don't, and to laugh exactly the right amount, not too little, which would make you a prig, not too much, which would make you a fool. You laughed the right amount. I have been watching you ever since. You have the reflex more deeply than anyone I have brought into the household in 15 years. You are also, which is rarer still, not enjoying the secrets. There are women here who develop in time a small unpleasant pleasure in knowing what the public does not, a smugness, a way of carrying themselves at a country dinner that betrays the carrier. Such women are a danger to the household, because the pleasure must eventually be fed, and they let something slip, not to betray, but to be seen to know. You do not have the pleasure. You have instead a kind of tiredness about the secrets, even at 23, even before you have been told most of them. That tiredness is the deepest qualification for the work I am about to give you. The Queen needs women around her who do not enjoy what they know. I have very few of them, and I am very tired myself, and I am minded to put you near her now, while you are young, so that she may have many years of you, because I think she will need many years of you, and I think the work I have done for her this past decade I will not be doing much longer, and I would like to leave her, when I go, with someone in the room who has the reflex and not the pleasure, and who will keep her, after I am gone, the way I have tried to keep her, which has been an honor and the work of my life and almost broken me, and which I will not lie to you about, because if I lied to you about it now, and you took the post on a lie, you would resent the post forever when the truth came, and so I will tell you plainly, in this room, in the only conversation we are going to have like this, what I am asking you to take on, and then you will say yes or no, and either answer is acceptable, and the saying no will not be held against you, and after this afternoon we will never speak of it in this way again." Madeleine sat very still. She understood she had been brought to the green room, not for a promotion but for a contract, and that the contract was the kind that, having heard the terms, you could not unhear, that even refusing it would mark you, that simply being told the terms was itself a passage you could not walk back from, and that Madame Charpentier was, with great fairness, making sure she understood this before going on. "I understand, madam," Madeleine said. "Good, good. Then I will tell you. The Prince Consort takes women. He has taken women since the 2nd year of the marriage, possibly earlier. He will continue to take them, in my professional judgment, for the whole of the rest of his life. There is no remedy. The Queen has weighed every remedy a queen has access to, and has decided, on grounds I will explain to you in a moment, that the best course is the one we are now on, which is to make of the matter, in public, nothing at all, and to ensure that the public nothing is total, and that private something is contained and managed year after year by the people in this household, of whom you will, if you accept, become one. The Queen is 28 years old. She made this decision when she was 24, in the 2nd year of her marriage, when the first of it became undeniable to her, in a single afternoon in this palace that I will not now describe to you. She made the decision alone, by the way. No one advised her to it. Her ministers would have advised her against it. She did not consult them. She sat in her own apartments for one long night, and worked through what was available to her, and chose the course we are on, and informed me of it the following morning in this same green room, and asked me whether I would help her carry it, and I said yes, because she was 24 and a queen, and entirely alone, and asking my help, and because I could see in her face that she had thought it through more clearly than the older men who would have advised her against it ever would have, and because she was, even then, even in the worst week of her life, the most formidable young woman I had ever served, and I would have done a great many less honourable things for her than agree to keep silent for the rest of my life. That was 4 years ago. We have kept silent for 4 years. We will keep silent, the people of this household, for the rest of her reign, which the actuaries tell me will be a long one, and we will pay for the keeping, all of us, in the various coins such keepings are paid in, and the keeping will become harder, not easier, as the years go on, because the strain of pretending something is not happening when it is happening is a strain that accumulates like a debt, with interest, and the women of this household are the ones who pay the interest, year by year, in their nerves and their marriages and their faces and their nights. Because the men cannot. The men are not in the rooms where the pretending is hardest. The men do not see her at the dressing table the morning after a country weekend. The men do not have to choose her perfume for the day on which everyone in the palace knows where her husband spent the night. The men handle the abstract part of the silence, which is the easier part, and we handle the human part, which is the harder. And I will not lie to you, Mademoiselle Vaury, the human part is very hard, and it will be harder for you than it has been for me, because I came to it in middle age, with my own life mostly settled, and you will come to it at 23, with no life of your own settled at all, and the post will not let you settle one easily, because the reflex you will deepen in this work does not switch off when you leave the palace. You cannot be a woman who is fluent in the second conversation by day, and a woman with a quiet, honest life of her own by night. You will find that the fluency follows you, that your young men, when you take them, sense in you a reserve they cannot name and grow uneasy, that your friendships outside the court thin because you cannot speak freely about your work, and cannot, in time, remember how to speak freely about anything, that you become, by the slow work of the years, a kind of woman who has only the court, because the court has trained out of her everything that would let her have anything else. I am that kind of woman now. I was not always. I made the trade, in stages, without knowing I was making it, and I do not wholly regret it, because the woman I serve is worth it, and the keeping is a real keeping, and a faithlessness here would do harm I could not bear. But I would not have you take it on without knowing what is on the other side of the trade. That is the only honesty available to me. I will not promise you it is worth it. I will only tell you the cost, and then you will decide. Madame Charpentier folded her hands. Take the night, Mademoiselle Vaury. Sleep on it. Come to me at noon tomorrow. If you say yes, I will begin your real instruction the same afternoon, and you will be at the Queen's side within the week. If you say no, I will arrange for you to be transferred, with no shame and no diminishment, to the household of the Princess Royal, whose own arrangement is simpler and whose service is shorter, and there will be no further mention of this conversation, ever, by either of us. Go and think. Madeleine went and thought and did not sleep, and walked the cold gravel paths of the palace garden in the small hours, and worked her way through the choice the way she would, in time, work through 1,000 smaller choices, weighing the visible costs against the invisible, the seen life against the unseen, and she arrived, by a route she could not afterward fully reconstruct, at the answer she would carry through the next 44 years, which was that the question Madame Charpentier had laid before her was not really a question about ambition or comfort or the shape of her own life, but a question about whether a young queen who had made a hard choice alone at 24 and asked for help in keeping it deserved to have that help from whoever was in a position to give it, for as long as she required it, regardless of the cost. And Madeleine found, walking the dark gravel, that she did not have it in her to say no to that the saying no would itself have been the kind of small careful self-protection that would have shrunk her to a person she did not wish to become, and that whatever the next 40 years cost her, the cost of having refused at 23 to stand beside a woman she had not yet truly met, but already by reputation and by Madame Charpentier's testimony, half admired, would be larger, would be the cost of having been smaller than the moment asked her to be, and that was a cost she found she could not pay, even to save herself the other one. She went to Madame Charpentier at noon and said yes. Madame Charpentier nodded, once without surprise, and that afternoon, in the same green room, the real instruction began, and Madeleine learned the names of the women, by then 4 of them, and the patterns of the country weekends, and the rule about Nuit d'Estavia, which she had not yet known, but which her own modest perfume case happily did not violate, and the small protocols by which the household managed the mornings after, and the larger protocol by which everything they did was, somehow, never quite to be acknowledged among themselves either, never named in plain language, even between the women who managed it, only ever spoken of in the slanting language of the second conversation. Tuesday's arrangement, the matter of the Charente house, His Royal Highness's late return, a vocabulary developed across years to permit the running of the thing without the saying of it, because Madeleine was learning that afternoon and through that spring and through the years to come, that to say it even among themselves was to make it the kind of fact that might one day be said outside themselves, that the discipline of the silence reached all the way down to the inside of the women keeping it, that they did not, even in private, even to each other, ever quite call the thing by its name, and that this was the deepest layer of the work, the layer Madame Charpentier had not entirely spelled out, and that Madeleine would only fully understand in the years to come, that they were not merely keeping a secret from the public, they were keeping a half-secret from themselves, declining to look at the whole of what they spent their lives managing, because to look at the whole of it would have been to ask whether it was bearable, and they had decided, all of them, at the moment they agreed to do the work, that the bearableness of it was the one question they could not afford to ask. And on her first morning in the Queen's apartments, the following Monday, in the spring of 1959, Madeleine Vaury was presented to Queen Sophia of Estavia, and the Queen, who had been told a young woman with the reflex was coming, looked up from the small writing desk where she was answering letters in her own hand, and held Madeleine's eyes for a long moment, and saw, Madeleine would think for years afterward, all the way through her, the green room and the gravel, and the yes at noon, the whole of it, in a single grave look, and then the Queen said, in a voice that was gentler than Madeleine had been led to expect, the first words Sophia of Estavia ever spoke to the woman who would stand at her shoulder for the next 38 years. "Welcome, Mademoiselle Vaury. I am told you are very promising. I hope, for your sake more than for mine, that they are wrong. The ones they are right about find this work very hard. Sit down. There is a letter I would like your hand on." The singer's name was Madeleine Vaury, and Madeleine learned it not from gossip but from the Queen, in the 3rd month of her service, which was the first sign Madeleine had that her position in the household was going to be different from any she had been led to expect, and that the Queen of Estavia handled the matter of her husband's women in a way that no one outside the green room circle could have guessed. It was a Tuesday morning in the summer of 1959. The court had returned the previous week from a long weekend at a country estate in the south, the kind of weekend that produced the particular set of small managerial difficulties Madame Charpentier had warned her about, and Madeleine had spent the Sunday and Monday in a steady, quiet engagement with those difficulties, the misrouted luggage that explained the late return of one motor car, the rearrangement of the seating plan for the Monday dinner, so that 2 people who must not be seated near each other were not, the small note to the housekeeper of the estate confirming that certain bedrooms had been aired in the customary way, which Madeleine had not understood the first time she wrote one, was the code for the particular discreet airing such bedrooms required after such weekends, and which she now wrote without thinking, the reflex deepening as Madame Charpentier had promised it would, sentence by quiet sentence. On the Tuesday morning the Queen called her into the small writing room and said, without preamble, "Sit down, Vaury. There is a letter I would like you to write for me, and before I dictate it I will need to tell you something, and I prefer to tell you in this room and on this morning rather than have you find it out by some other route, because I have decided, since you came to us, that you are to be told things directly by me rather than by Madame Charpentier where it is possible. because Madame Charpentier is tired, and I would like her to be a little less tired, and because I find you take direct telling well, which is rare and useful." Madeleine sat. The Queen looked at her over the small desk, and Madeleine, who had now been in the personal household for nearly 3 months and had learned to read the Queen's face in the small ways one learns such things, saw that this morning's telling was going to be of a different order from the small daily tellings she had grown used to, and arranged her own face into the particular composed neutrality the Queen seemed to prefer in her women, the face that registered understanding without registering anything else. "There is a woman called Madeleine Vaury," the Queen said. "She is a soprano. She made her debut at the opera here in the spring of 1955. She is, I am told by people who know about such things, a singer of considerable gift. My husband has been involved with her since approximately the summer of 1956, which is to say for some 3 years. The involvement is not over. I do not expect it to be over for perhaps another year, possibly 2. I tell you this because the letter I am about to dictate is to her, and you will know from its contents that it is to her. And I would rather you knew the larger context in plain words now than puzzle it out from the letter in front of you, which would distract you from the letter, and the letter is the more important thing. Are you ready?" Madeleine said she was ready, in the level voice the work required, and she was, externally, but inwardly she was doing the small frantic work the reflex had not yet entirely smoothed out of her, the work of registering that the Queen of Estavia was about to dictate a letter to her husband's mistress, that she, Madeleine Vaury, 23, 3 months in the personal household, was to write it, that the Queen had not even said this with any particular drama, had said it the way one says, "We shall be working on the seating plan," and that everything Madame Charpentier had told her about the depth of the work was true, and was, if anything, an understatement. The letter was short. The Queen dictated it slowly, in a level tone, and Madeleine wrote in her clear, careful hand, and the letter, when it was done, said, "Madame Vaury, I have learned with great regret of the difficulty you are experiencing with the management of your career, which I understand is at a delicate stage. I have taken the liberty of writing to M. Berthelin at the opera, whose family has long enjoyed our regard, to commend your gifts to his attention as he considers the casting of next season's productions. M. Berthelin will write to you in due course. He is a man of great discretion and good judgment, and I am sure you will find him helpful. With kind wishes for your continued health and success, I am very sincerely yours, Sophia R." Madeleine sat with her pen above the page for a moment after the dictation ended, because she did not know whether she had heard what she had heard, and the Queen, who saw the moment, did her the mercy of speaking first. "You will be wondering why," the Queen said, "and I will explain it now, once, and I will not need to explain it again, because once you have heard the explanation, you will be able to apply the principle to all the similar letters you will write for me over the coming years, of which there will be more than one. It is in our interest, Vaury, that Madame Vaury should have a flourishing career. I do not mean it is in my interest in some sentimental sense that I wish my husband's woman well as a kind of magnanimous gesture. The magnanimous gesture is a luxury reserved for women whose situations permit it, and mine does not. I mean it is in our practical interest, the interest of the Crown, that Madame Vaury should be busy, fulfilled, and well employed in a manner that takes her, regularly, to other capitals, requires her to attend rehearsals and performances, and engagements that fill her time, and provides her with the satisfactions of a serious career, because a woman in such a situation is a woman who is not free to make demands of my husband that he would find inconvenient, and that would, in the making, become inconvenient also to me. A bored woman, an unoccupied woman, a woman whose only investment is in her relation with him, becomes over time a woman who wants more from that relation than the relation can bear, who pushes, who threatens, who lets things be known, sometimes from frustration and sometimes from love, and sometimes simply because there is nothing else in her week to fill her, and such a woman is a danger to the discretion of the whole arrangement, and the discretion of the whole arrangement is the thing I am charged with protecting. A woman whose career is going well is a woman who has other things on her mind, other places to be, other letters to answer than his. She is also a woman who has something to lose if the matter ever became public, because a public scandal would damage her career, which is now considerable, and which she will not, accordingly, risk. The career Vaury is the strongest discretion I can put around her, stronger than any pressure I or anyone else could apply directly, and so I am writing to M. Berthelin to commend her to him, and I will write to others, in time, on her behalf. And I do this not despite the situation, but precisely because of it, and the writing of this letter is, I want you to understand, an act of the most cold-blooded political competence available to me, and not an act of pity or generosity or weakness of any kind whatever. Do you understand the principle? Madeleine said she understood the principle, and she did with a clarity that startled her, because the principle was so cleanly unsentimental that it made everything she had been quietly arranging in her head about the Queen, the picture of the wronged wife enduring with quiet dignity, the picture the kingdom in fact carried of Queen Sophia, collapse and rearrange itself into a different and considerably more formidable figure, a young woman who had sat in her apartments at 24 and worked out, alone, that the most effective way to manage her husband's women was to ensure that they were not desperate, and who had been running the kingdom's discretion on that principle ever since, in cold detail, without telling anyone she was doing it, allowing the world to think her merely patient. Good, the Queen said. Now write the letter to M. Berthelin in your own draft, and bring it to me this afternoon, and I will make my corrections, and we will send it tomorrow. Madame Vasari will receive my letter to her on Friday, by which time M. Berthelin will already have begun to consider her in a more concrete way for next season, and she will conclude, correctly, that I have intervened on her behalf, and the conclusion will produce in her a feeling for me, which I will not call gratitude, the word is too clean for the relations between such people, but which will function, in the next critical conversation between her and my husband about her place in his life, as a small heavy thing on my side of the scale, the one she will not be able entirely to ignore. That is how the scale is loaded. Vaury, one small heavy thing at a time, over years, and at the end of years the scale tips, and the woman departs of her own accord, and the public has been spared a scandal, and another woman arrives, and we begin again, and it is the work of a lifetime, and it is not done with anger, and it is not done with patience, and it is not, above all, done with hope, because hope in this work would be the most expensive mistake a woman in my position could make. I do not hope my husband will change. I do not hope the next woman will be the last. I do not hope, even, that the public will never know. I plan, instead, for each of those things to be untrue, and I arrange my response to their untruth with the same care a general arranges his response to the certainty of weather. There is no weather one hopes away. There is only weather one prepares for. Go and draft the letter to Berthelin. Madeleine went and drafted the letter and brought it back, and the Queen made 3 small corrections in her own hand, one of which Madeleine, even years later, could not improve upon. A single change of preposition that altered the entire register of the letter from a request to a courtly assumption of compliance, and the letter went, and M. Berthelin replied within the week with the most delicate flexibility, and Madeleine Vaury was cast in 2 productions that winter and 3 the following season, and received Sophia's note on the Friday and wrote back, in her turn, a letter of thanks so carefully composed that Madeleine, reading it aloud to the Queen on the Tuesday following, paused at one phrase and looked up, and the Queen looked back, and the 2 of them, the Queen and the lady-in-waiting, exchanged a single grave look across the writing desk, the first such look they had ever exchanged on the matter, and the Queen said quietly, "Yes, she is intelligent. Of course she is. She would have to be, or he would have lost interest in the first month. Make a note, Vaury. Vasari is intelligent. That is information. That is information we will need in the matter of the eventual departure. Note it." And Madeleine noted it, in a small book the Queen kept for the purpose, a book Madeleine had not until that morning known existed, and which she was now to be the keeper of, a book full of small careful entries in the Queen's hand, and now beginning to acquire entries in Madeleine's, the most extraordinary private document the Kingdom of Estavia ever did not know it possessed, a strategic ledger on the management of the Prince Consort's lovers, kept by the Queen and a 23-year-old lady-in-waiting with the reflex, recording the things they would need to know later, the singer's intelligence, the singer's career trajectory, the singer's likely points of vulnerability, the the singer's letter style, all of it filed and dated and cross-referenced, the way another sort of household keeps accounts of the silver. Vasari, intelligent. Italian father, French mother, raised in Lyon. Wants a career on the international stage. Ambition real and central. Career currently in delicate phase. Will benefit from intervention. Will respond to intervention by adjustment of feeling toward us. Useful. That was the entry, in Madeleine's hand, made on the morning Vasari's letter arrived, and the Queen read it over her shoulder, and nodded once and said, "Just so. You have it." That afternoon Madeleine returned to her own small room in the household quarters and sat for a long time on the edge of her bed in the early summer light and tried to absorb the discovery that the largest reorientation of her year had not been the death of her father, which had happened in the spring, nor the falling out with her elder sister, which had happened over Christmas, but this, the discovery that the woman she served and to whom she had agreed to give the next 40 years of her professional life, was not the patient queen of the public imagination, but a strategist of cold and exact competence, who at 24 had decided that hope was the enemy, and had been running the discretion of her own humiliation by the principles of military planning for half a decade, with results so quietly successful that no one in the kingdom, not the press, not the cabinet, not the foreign courts, suspected the operation existed at all. Madeleine understood, sitting on the bed in the late light, that she had not been hired into a kept silence. She had been recruited into a campaign, that what she had taken to be a household running on the avoidance of an unpleasantness was, in fact, a household running on the patient, decade-long, woman by woman dismantling of an unpleasantness from within, and that the woman running it was the most impressive person Madeleine had ever encountered, and that the impressive woman was, beneath all the cold competence, 28 years old, married to a man who did not love her in any way that was useful to her, raising 2 small children, governing a kingdom by day, and managing her own private war by night with a small ledger and a sequence of carefully chosen letters, and a young provincial girl now sitting on a bed trying to understand what she had agreed to. Madeleine wept then, briefly, alone, the only time in the first year, and she wept not out of horror, which would have been the public response, the poor Queen response, the response the Queen herself would have rejected as a sentimental impertinence. She wept out of something more like recognition, the kind of weeping a person does on finding that the world contains a kind of bravery the person had not known existed, and that she had now been admitted to its service, and was expected to rise to it, and might not, and probably would not, and would spend her life trying anyway, because the woman at the centre of the bravery was 28 and alone and asking, in her sideways unsentimental way, for help. Madeleine wept for 10 minutes, washed her face, returned to her duties, and never wept on the matter again for 38 years, which was its own discipline, and which began that summer evening with her decision on the edge of the bed that the bravery she had stumbled into was a thing she would rise to as fully as she could manage, and that the rising would consist, almost entirely, of not weeping again, of becoming, by sheer practice, the kind of woman who could note in a ledger that another woman was intelligent and useful, and could be loaded onto a scale, and could do it the way the Queen did it, without hatred and without pity, by the principles of weather. Hélène Vasari's career flourished, that year and the next and the years after, exactly as Sophia had predicted. The international engagements grew, the travel grew, the demands she made on the Prince Consort's time and attention grew, by a slow inevitable arithmetic, less. He could not summon her on a Tuesday if she was in Vienna for the week. He could not detain her at a country house if she had a rehearsal in Paris the following morning. He could not, eventually, hold her interest as completely as he had once held it, because her attention had other and finer satisfactions now, and these satisfactions had been arranged, with great delicacy, by the wife of the man whose attention she was losing. By the spring of 1962 the affair was, in the small careful judgment of the ledger, winding down, of itself, on the predicted schedule. By the autumn of that year it was over. Madame Vasari married, 3 years later, a French conductor of some eminence, and lived out a long and distinguished career, and grew old in a villa above a Mediterranean town, and gave music lessons to local children in her last years, and remembered, when she remembered the Prince Consort at all, that his wife had been, in some way she could never quite specify, the most unexpected ally of her early career, and never knew, never could have known, the small entry in a small book in a writing room in Estavia. Vasari concluded, departure clean, method confirmed, apply to subsequent matters. And in that writing room in the autumn of 1962, the Queen looked across the desk at Madeleine, who was 26 now, and the fully formed instrument of the campaign she had wept over at 23, and said in a tone that was as near to private warmth as Sophia of Estavia ever permitted herself in those years, "Well, Vaury, we have done one, there will be others. But we have done one, you and I, and the method holds, and that is no small thing in this work, to have something hold. You have been very good. I find I am grateful to you, and I will not say it again, but you should hear it once, because the next one is going to be harder, and you should know, going in, that the woman you are doing it for is grateful. There, now we shall not speak of it. Bring me the morning's correspondence." And Madeleine brought the morning's correspondence, and the work went on, and the next one came, The Ambassador's Wife, in the middle period, and was harder, exactly as the Queen had foretold, and the ledger thickened, and the years began to take on the long, quiet shape they would keep for the next 3 decades, and Madeleine Vaury, who had wept once on the edge of a bed in the summer of 1959, did not weep again, and learned to write the letters in her sleep, and grew, in time, into a woman who could note an enemy's intelligence in a ledger without flinching, and was, by her 30th birthday, exactly what Madame Charpentier had foreseen in her at 23, the next keeper of the campaign, ready for the long, unglamorous middle period during which the strategy would be tested. The women would not all be as tractable as Madeleine Vaury. The public discretion would be threatened more than once, and the Queen, the 28-year-old strategist of the cold writing desk, would face, in the late summer of 1971, the single afternoon on which her whole long calculation came within one breath of breaking, and Madeleine Vaury would be in the room when it nearly broke, and would help her hold, and would remember the afternoon every day of the long quiet rest of her life, and write it down at last, dictating in a shaking hand at 90, as the heart of everything she had been keeping, the moment the kingdom never knew it had passed through. The silenced Queen had bought herself by paying with the whole shape of her own private life, and that we will, in the parts that follow, finally tell. The Ambassador's Wife was the harder case the Queen had foretold, and she was harder for reasons that Helene Vasary's case had not prepared the household for, and the 4 years between the singer's clean departure in 1962 and the full unfolding of the new matter in 1966 were, Madeleine would think looking back, the 4 years in which the household discovered the limits of the method and learned that the method's strength was also its fragility, that a strategy built on the assumption that the women would always have something to lose, an ambition or a career or a public face, broke down at once when applied to a woman who had nothing the Queen could either give her or threaten to take away. Her name was Elisabeth Vondré, and she was the wife of the Estavian ambassador to a court in northern Europe, and she was 36 years old when the matter began, and she was, Madeleine wrote in the ledger, when the first reports came in from the country house at Charente, a woman of no public ambition, no career, no profession, no apparent vanity. Married 14 years, no children, independent income from her mother's family, modest but sufficient. Reputed bookish, reputed lonely. Reputed to despise her husband and to despise the diplomatic life, and to have no plans to leave either. No social hunger that can be observed. The standard instruments will not work on her. We will need new ones. The Queen read the entry and was quiet for a long time, and then said, in the level voice she used it for the gravest household decisions, "Yes, that is correct. The standard instruments will not work. She wants nothing we can offer, and fears nothing we can withdraw. We are in new country, Vaury, and I want you to understand that we will not panic. We will study her. We will discover, over time, what she does want, because every human being wants something, and the woman who appears to want nothing wants the most particular and the most carefully hidden thing of all, and our work in this case will be the slow, patient identification of what that thing is. Until we identify it, we contain. Containment is the holding action. We will buy time with containment, and we will use the time to study, and at some point in the next 2 years or 4 years or 6, we will know what to do, because we will know what she wants. The work, Vaury, has just become much more interesting. Note the date. We are in the second phase of the campaign. The first phase was Vasari. The second phase begins now. Containment in this case meant first of all the management of the ambassador, M. Vaury, a man of 52, career diplomat, whose government would shortly need to know nothing in such a way that the not knowing would not embarrass it later. The Queen handled this herself in a single audience with the foreign minister in the spring of 1966. An audience to Madeleine was not present, and after which she would only ever learn from the Queen's own brief account that the minister had been left in a state of perfectly informed ignorance, that he understood without having been told that a matter existed, and that he was to ensure the ambassador remained in his post, and remained, professionally, immune from any consequence that might flow from the matter, and that the minister had agreed to this without it ever being put into words. By a slow, grave nod across a desk that had functioned, in the world Madeleine inhabited, as the entire signing of a treaty. The ambassador, accordingly, remained at his northern post, and his wife came and went between the embassy and the country houses of Estavia, with the official cover of family illness and personal travel. And the ambassador knew, as everyone knew, and said nothing, as everyone said nothing, and was therefore protected, and was therefore complicit, and was therefore M. Vaury, being a sensitive man who had loved his wife once, and now lived with the daily knowledge of what she was, slowly and quietly being destroyed by the arrangement, which was a cost the campaign had not until then fully accounted for, the cost paid by the husbands of the other women, and which Madeleine, watching M. Vaury at 3 state dinners over the course of that summer, watching him grow grey in a way that had nothing to do with age, added to the ledger as a new column, third-party costs. Husbands and the Queen read the addition and did not correct it, and said only, in the level voice, "Yes, we must keep that column. It will grow in time. Note Vaury's grey hair. Note that he has begun drinking more than he did." Such observations are useful for what they predict, and they are also, Vaury, the only honesty available to us in this matter, which is the honest counting of what we cannot prevent. Keep the column. Containment of the affair itself was more delicate, because Madame Vaury was not a singer who could be sent on tour or an actress whose engagements could be quietly increased. She was a woman with nothing to do, who could be in any country house at any time, and was, with a frequency that the equerries' diaries grew unable to manage, in many of them, and the Prince Consort, whom Madeleine was now beginning to understand as a man not so much in the grip of any single woman as in the grip of his own constant need for the next one, had become, in the case of Elizabeth Vaury, more attached than was customary for him, more steady in the attachment than the household had previously observed, and the question of why she held him, this bookish, lonely, childless woman, who appeared to despise everything around her, including, increasingly, him, was the question. Madeleine and the Queen spent the autumn of 1966 and the spring of 1967 patiently turning over between them in the writing room, between the morning correspondence and the afternoon engagements, as one turns over a lock for which one has not yet found the key. The answer, when it came to Madeleine and not to the Queen, and it came not in the writing room, but in a corridor of a country house in the late summer of 1967, on a Saturday evening when Madeleine, who had been sent down ahead of the Queen to inspect the arrangements, happened to pass an open door and saw, in the long mirror at the end of an unoccupied bedroom, Elizabeth Vaury sitting alone at a dressing table, not preparing for the evening, simply sitting, her hands flat on the table on either side of an open book, looking at her own reflection with an expression that Madeleine, who had now spent 8 years reading faces for a living, recognized at once and could not, for a full second, name, because she had never seen it on a woman in those rooms before, and when she did name it, walking on down the corridor with her composure intact, and her heart going hard in the way the work taught one to keep secret, even from one's own face, the name was contempt for the self, and Madeleine understood, with the suddenness of all true understandings, that Madame Vaury despised herself even more thoroughly than she despised everything around her, that the affair with the Prince Consort was not pleasure or ambition or attachment, but a kind of slow ongoing self-injury, that the woman wanted to be the kind of woman who was used and discarded by a careless prince, because being that kind of woman confirmed for her a verdict she had long ago passed on herself, that what Elizabeth Vondrale wanted, the particular hidden thing that every human being wanted, and that the Queen had said this woman wanted most carefully of all, was her own degradation, and that the Prince Consort was, to her, not a lover but an instrument, and that the instrument was working, was performing its function, was lowering her in her own estimation week by week exactly as she required, and that no career, no ambition, no public reward could ever be offered as a counterweight to a person whose deepest secret want was to be made smaller, because everything the Queen could offer would have lifted her, and lifting was the one thing Elizabeth Vondrale's hidden architecture could not bear. Madeleine returned to the capital on the Monday and told the Queen, in the writing room, in plain words. The Queen listened, and Madeleine watched her face go through the small set of changes it went through when receiving information of the gravest order. The slight tightening at the corners of the mouth, the held breath that no one not watching for it would have noticed, and then the long, slow exhalation that meant the new information had been absorbed and integrated into the campaign. Yes, of course. You have seen it, Vaury, and I had not, and I will tell you why I had not. I had not because the possibility had not occurred to me. I have spent my whole strategic life assuming that the women want to rise, because every woman I had encountered until now did want to rise, in one form or another, and the campaign was built on that assumption, and the assumption was sufficient until now. I had not considered a woman who wanted to fall. This is my failure of imagination, and it is a serious one, and I will not make it again. The question now is what we do with the discovery, and the discovery, I see at once, makes the situation both worse and more manageable than I had feared, and I will explain both. The Queen rose from the desk, which she did only when working through the hardest material, and walked to the window and looked out at the garden, and Madeleine, who had grown by now into a woman the Queen spoke to as nearly an equal in such moments, waited at the desk with her pen poised over the ledger and her face and her whole attention given to the working out about to happen, which she would copy down word for word as the Queen produced it. Because the Queen had told her, in the 3rd year of their work together, that the recorded thinking of these afternoons would be the household's only inheritance from the campaign, and that Madeleine was to preserve it exactly as it occurred. And Madeleine had been doing so ever since, and it was the ledger's deepest archive, the Queen's thinking, a record of strategic reasoning so honest and so cold that no historian would ever quite believe a Queen had produced it, even if the document ever surfaced, which it would not, because Madeleine had decided, around her 10th year, that the ledger would in the end be burned, and the Queen had been told of the decision and had approved. Worse, Vaury, because such a woman cannot be detached by the conventional means. She will not tire of him, because she is not with him for satisfaction. She is with him for an injury that must be renewed. The renewal is the point. Therefore she will hold on, as long as the injury is producing its effect, which is to say, as long as she remains kind of woman, who is used by a prince, which she will remain as long as she is being used, which means the relation is, by its own internal logic, self-sustaining in a way Vasari's was not, and could continue indefinitely, possibly for decades, until one of them died, because there is nothing in the woman that wants the relation to end, and there is, alas, nothing in my husband that would end it on his own initiative, as long as her alibi and her quiet presence and her absence of demand continue to suit him. That is the worst part. We may be looking at a permanent feature, not a phase, and a permanent feature is something we have not faced before, and we will have to think about what a permanent feature means for the discretion of the wider arrangement. Make a note. The matter of Vondrale may not resolve. Plan for permanence. Madeleine wrote. Better, however, Vaury, in this single respect. Such a woman is not a danger. She will not threaten. She will not make scenes. She will not allow her name to come out, because her name coming out would convert her from a secretly degraded woman, which is the role she is sustaining herself by, into a publicly humiliated woman, which is a different role entirely, and would, paradoxically, restore her in a way she cannot tolerate, would force the world to either pity her or condemn her, and either pity or condemnation would lift her out of the small dark seat she has chose to occupy and into the bright public space, and she cannot bear that, and so she will be, of all my husband's women, the most actively complicit in our discretion, more actively complicit even than the household, because her own pathology requires the secret as much as ours does. She will not leak. She will not threaten to leak. She will spend the rest of her life in this arrangement, protecting it as carefully as I do, for exactly the opposite reasons, and so the public danger of this affair, which I had feared was great, is in fact small, and the personal cost of it, which I had feared was small, is in fact great, and we have a strategic stability we did not expect, and a moral disturbance we did not foresee. And the question, Vaury, is what we are obliged to do about the moral disturbance, given that the strategic stability is now in place and the public is in no danger. The Queen turned from the window. Madeleine looked up. The two of them held a look that was, Madeleine would write decades later in the dictation, the gravest single look of our long association, a look in which a queen who had spent 8 years running a campaign of cold containment was, for one afternoon, in a writing room in the autumn of 1967, considering whether the campaign's success had reached the point at which it required of Sophia of Estavia, who was supposed to consider only the public interest, a private intervention on behalf of one of the women she was supposedly defending herself against, who was, by every line of the ledger, an enemy, and who was, the Queen had just seen as clearly as Madeleine had seen, also, before being an enemy, a human being engaged in the slow public destruction of herself, which a queen with the resources and the access of the Queen of Estavia could in fact, if she chose, do something about. Vaury, the Queen said, and her voice had a fineness in it Madeleine had not heard before. What would you do, if you were me, in this matter? It was the first time the Queen had ever directly asked Madeleine's view on a strategic question of the campaign. Madeleine knew it was a question that would never be asked again, that the asking was itself a particular intimacy and a particular crisis, and that her answer had to be honest, because there would be no other moment in their lives in which the Queen would receive her honesty in this register, and Madeleine took time, longer than she had ever taken in answering the Queen, and thought through the whole shape of what the Queen was really asking, and then said, I would write to her, ma'am, not to detach her from him. Detachment is not available to us, you have just shown why. I would write to her about something else, something she does not know I have noticed, something only another woman might offer. The book on the dressing table, ma'am. She was sitting alone with an open book and not reading it. I saw the title by accident in the mirror. It was a book of essays by a French philosopher, a difficult one, the kind a serious mind reads alone. She has, ma'am, a serious mind which no one in those houses ever speaks to her about, because they all see her only as the wife of an ambassador and now as the mistress of a prince, and no one has, in years possibly, addressed the part of her that is reading philosophy alone in country house bedrooms. I would write to her about the book. I would commend a recent essay in the Review Critique that takes issue with the philosopher in question, and that she will probably not have seen, since the review is not widely read among the embassies. I would ask her view of it. I would, in short, treat her as a serious mind, which is the one form of recognition her arrangement with my husband can never provide her, because my husband does not read philosophy, and would not, if he did, discuss it with her, since the part of her that reads philosophy is precisely the part she has gone to him to hurt. I would offer her, ma'am, in plain words, a small steady stream of acknowledgement of the better self she is trying to bury, and I would do it not to detach her from him, because as you have said we cannot, but to give her a quiet alternative axis of being, a thread back to the woman she was before she chose the small dark seat, and over time, ma'am, over years possibly, that thread might prove stronger than the seat, and she might rise from it of her own accord, and the arrangement might quietly end, and she might survive into something better, and we will not know whether she does for a long time, and we may never know whether we caused it, and that is, I think, ma'am, the only thing I can think of that would address the moral disturbance without sacrificing the strategic stability, and it is also, I should say, ma'am, the kind of intervention only you could make, because only the Queen of Estavia, writing personally to a woman in her position, carries the weight that would persuade Madame Vaury that the recognition is not a flattery, but a genuine address of one serious mind to another, and any lesser correspondent would not register on her at all. That is what I would do, ma'am. The Queen looked at her for a long time across the writing room. "You have grown, Vaury," she said at last very quietly, "into the woman I hoped you would grow into. I see now why I took you on at 23 over the objections of 3 senior ladies who thought you too young. I see also why I shall never tell you so again, because the saying of it would alter the working between us in ways that would diminish both of us. And we must remain what we have made ourselves into, which is something more useful than what mere affection would have made us. So I tell you once, in this room in this afternoon, and we will not return to it. You are right about Vondrey. I shall write the letter you have described. You will help me compose it. You will draft a version this evening, and I will work upon it, and we shall send it within the week, and we shall begin the other campaign, the smaller and harder one, the campaign for her better self, which has no precedent in our work, and will not appear in the public ledger of the kingdom, and may save a woman, or may not save her, but which we are now obliged to undertake, because we have seen what she is doing to herself, and the rule of this household. Vaury, the rule I have not until this afternoon entirely understood myself, the rule I think we have just discovered together, is that we do not pretend not to see what we have seen, even when we cannot say what we have seen aloud, even when the seeing requires us to take on yet another secret labour in addition to all the others. Because the moment we begin to pretend not to see, we will have become exactly the kingdom we are working to prevent, the kingdom that walks past the fire and agrees there is no fire and lets the people in the fire burn, and I will not run such a kingdom, even in private, even in this room, even with only you to witness whether I run it or not. We will see her, we will write to her, we will do the additional work. Go and draft the letter." Madeleine went and drafted the letter, and the additional campaign began that autumn, and ran in secret in parallel with the public campaign for the next 11 years, 11 long years of careful letters from the Queen of Estavia to her husband's permanent mistress, letters about philosophy and books and the journals of the season, letters that no one outside the writing room ever knew about, letters that built between the two women a strange, unconfessable kind of regard. Neither friendship nor enmity, nor anything the language of those years had a name for, a regard conducted entirely on the surface of paper, while everything beneath the surface remained exactly as it had been. And the affair continued, as the Queen had predicted, year after year, and the ledger filled, and Madame Vondrey sat at her dressing tables in the country houses with her open books, and read slowly, across those 11 years, more and more of the review critique, and wrote back, more and more, in letters of her own that grew, by the small measure of such things, less self-contemptuous in their phrasing, and Madeleine watched the long invisible operation unfold and thought, on certain afternoons, that she was watching the most extraordinary thing Sophia of Estavia would ever do. More extraordinary even than the public campaign, more extraordinary than the throne she sat upon, the slow, patient, parallel saving of a woman who was, by every official measure, her enemy, conducted in absolute privacy across more than a decade, for no reward that anyone would ever know about, by the principles of seeing, of refusing to walk past the fire, of doing the additional work, because the seeing required it, which were the principles that in the end made Madeleine Vaury, decades later, weeping for the second time in her life, as she dictated the chapter to her granddaughter, name Queen Sophia in the manuscript, in plain words at last, the finest human being I ever served, and the only person I ever loved, and the loving was not the kind of loving that asked anything back, which is, I think now at 90, the only kind of loving worth the name, and which I learned from her, and which has been the structure of my own long life, and which is the deepest thing this whole long book is, in the end, about. The crack came from outside the kingdom, as such cracks usually do, and it came in the early summer of 1968. And it taught Madeleine, who had thought after the Vondrey discovery that she had seen the gravest of the household's possibilities, that she had seen only the gravest of its private ones, and that the public possibilities were a different order of thing, faster, less amenable to study, governed by forces no ledger could fully anticipate, and that the campaign's preparation for them had been, despite the Queen's foresight, less complete than the household had believed. It came in the form of a telephone call from the Estavian ambassador in Switzerland, taken by the Queen's senior private secretary at 4 in the afternoon on a Thursday, and conveyed to the Queen by him within the hour, and conveyed by the Queen to Madeleine in the writing room within the hour after that, and the substance of it was that a Zurich weekly of small circulation but considerable journalistic seriousness was preparing for its next issue a story whose contents, as the ambassador had been able to learn through a contact in the magazine's own offices, were these: a detailed account, sourced to an unnamed former member of the Estavian Foreign Service, of the Prince Consort's affair with a singer named Madeleine Vaury between 1956 and 1962, with names, dates, the names of the country houses, the names of the two equerries who had managed the discreet motor cars, and a single corroborating photograph taken at long lens by a freelance Italian on a hotel terrace in Lucerne in 1960, of the Prince and Madame Vasari leaving an apartment at 6 in the morning, the Prince with his coat unbuttoned, and Madame Vasari laughing in a manner that admitted no other reading. The story was set for the following Wednesday's issue. The ambassador had 3 working days, including the day of the call, to prevent it. He had requested instructions. The Queen received this from the senior secretary, the Comte de Lassay, a man of 60 whom Madeleine had grown to respect across her 9 years in the household, and who was on this afternoon visibly shaken, his face the particular grey that men of his profession achieved when the work they had been managing for years was suddenly threatened with becoming the work the public would judge them by. The Queen heard him out, asked 2 clarifying questions in the level voice she reserved for the gravest matters, dismissed him with instructions to wait in the small antechamber, and turned to Madeleine, who had been at the writing desk through the whole audience and had not moved, and said, very quietly, "Bring the ledger, the Vasari section, and the contacts page from 1961, and the Lucerne file, if we still have it. We will work for an hour, then I will see Lassay again." Madeleine brought what was wanted. The Vasari section of the ledger filled now 140 pages, the slow accumulation of 6 years of correspondence and observation and post-affair monitoring. The contacts page from 1961 listed the 17 people who had been close enough to the Charente and Lucerne weekends of that year to have known the substance of what was now being prepared. The Lucerne file was a thin folder of household notes from the summer of 1960, which Madeleine had compiled at the time without fully understanding why the Queen had asked for them, and which contained, she discovered now, opening it for the first time in 8 years, exactly the information the Queen had foreseen would be needed. Exactly today: the name of the hotel, the layout of the terrace, the date and approximate time of the Prince's departure, and a small marginal note in the Queen's own hand from that long ago summer, photograph possible from terrace at adjacent hotel. No action available at the time, mark for future. "You see, Vaury," the Queen said, looking at the 8-year-old note, I knew at the time that someone had taken it. We had no evidence then, only the layout of the terrace and the angle of the sun, and the certainty that any competent photographer who had positioned himself at the 3rd floor of the Carlton Lac, which any photographer following the Prince that week would have done, would have had the image. I made the note because I expected the image to surface eventually. 8 years is rather longer than I had anticipated, but here it is, at last, and we are prepared, because we have known for 8 years that it existed, and we have spent those 8 years considering what we would do when it appeared, and the time has now come, and we have, by my reckoning, 3 working days, of which one is half spent, and that is sufficient if we move now, and we shall." Madeleine, who had thought she had grown beyond surprise at the depth of the Queen's preparation, sat at the desk and absorbed the small enormous fact that the Queen had been holding contingency plans against this photograph for 8 years, that the 8-year-old marginal note was not foresight in the dramatic sense, but routine, professional housekeeping in the Queen's own mind, and that the campaign, which Madeleine had thought of as a present tense operation, was in fact a structure that extended decades into the future on the assumption that every public risk would, given time enough, materialize, and that the Queen had been preparing for each materialization, quietly, while doing everything else, for the whole of her reign. Madeleine had a brief vertiginous sense of the scale of the mind opposite her, and set it aside because there was work, and the work was now. "The story has 4 pillars, Vaury," the Queen said, listing them on her fingers. "The unnamed source from our Foreign Service, the photograph, the corroborating dates and house names, the publication's editorial appetite to run such a piece. We must address all four within 3 days, and we must address them in such a way that each pillar's removal does not draw attention to the removal, because a story that is suppressed by visible force becomes itself a larger story than the original. As you know, we will be quiet. Take dictation. Madeleine took dictation for the next 40 minutes, and what the Queen produced, sitting at the desk in the late afternoon light, was a 4-part operational plan of such precision and such restraint that Madeleine, who had transcribed many such plans by then, recognized it as the most consequential single piece of strategic thinking she had ever recorded, and which she will here summarize rather than reproduce in full, because the document itself ran to many pages and is preserved among Madeleine's papers in the ledger, and is even today, half a century later, a model of its kind that anyone with the patience to learn the second conversation could read with profit. The 4 pillars were addressed thus: the unnamed source, the Queen, working from the Vasari section of the ledger, and a separate file Madeleine had not until that afternoon known existed; the foreign service profiles, a compendium of dossiers on every Estavian diplomat who had served abroad during the Vasari years, identified within 20 minutes the most probable single source, a former second secretary named Lambrechts, who had been dismissed in 1965 for an unrelated matter of expenses, and who had nursed, by the household's monitoring, a steady resentment of the foreign minister and a more diffuse resentment of the crown, and who lived now in a small apartment in Brussels and was known to take an interest in journalism and in checks. The Queen named Lambrechts. The senior secretary was to be told to confirm by quiet inquiry within 12 hours, and if Lambrechts was indeed the source, he was to be approached not by anyone connected to the crown but by an intermediary, a Belgian lawyer of impeccable discretion, whom the household had used twice before for matters of this kind, and was to be offered not money for retraction, which would corrupt the transaction, but legal representation in a separate civil matter pending against him in the Belgian courts, the existence of which the household had been keeping track of for 2 years against exactly such a moment, and which was a matter Lambrechts could not afford to lose and could not afford to win without help, and the offer of help was to be made in such a way that the connection between the offer and the magazine story would be understood by Lambrechts without ever being stated, and the offer was to be conditional on no formal cooperation with the magazine in question or any successor publication. And Lambrechts, the Queen judged, would understand the offer and accept it, because Lambrechts was a man who measured his life in small advantages, and would calculate correctly that the small advantage of the magazine's fee was less than the larger advantage of the legal representation, and so the first pillar would quietly cease to support the story by the Monday. The photograph. The freelance Italian who had taken it was named Aldo Brescia. The household had a note of his name in the Lucerne file, and he was, 8 years later, still working, and his work was now sold through an agency in Milan. The photograph itself had been sold once to the Zurich Weekly for an exclusive fee, but the underlying negative remained, by the standard contracts of such agencies, the property of the agency, and the agency was a business that had a long-standing relationship with a luxury watchmaker in Geneva, and the luxury watchmaker had a long-standing relationship with the Estavian crown, which had bought the watches for the royal household for 40 years, and the watchmaker had a son who was being considered for a minor honour the following spring, and the Queen, who had read a paper on the watchmaker's family 3 years before, for entirely unrelated reasons, remembered the connection, and the chain of arrangements by which a quiet word from the watchmaker's son's prospective sponsor to the agency in Milan, to the photographer's professional interests could result, by the Tuesday, in the agency's quiet decision that the photograph's distribution rights were unfortunately encumbered by a prior claim that made the magazine's exclusive license regrettably invalid, and that the magazine's editor would be informed of this on the Tuesday by the agency's lawyer, and the photograph would, by the Tuesday evening, no longer be available to run, regardless of whether the rest of the story remained. The corroborating dates and house names. These the Queen judged could not be removed, because they were too widely known. What could be done was to undermine their evidentiary weight by ensuring that, on the very day of the magazine's intended publication, a separate and apparently unrelated story would appear in a more prominent French paper, a story prepared by the household's friends at that paper over the past year, against exactly such a future need. The story being a flattering long-form profile of the prince consort's work with the particular charity for war veterans, with photographs and quotations, and a tone of unmistakable warmth, the timing of which would, by simple proximity, render any contemporaneous scandal piece in a Swiss weekly look to the reading public, who would see both, like the kind of small jealous attack a man of consequence routinely attracts, and would discredit the Zurich piece by association, without ever addressing it directly. And the editor of the Zurich Weekly, who would see the French paper that morning, would understand at once that his story had been overtaken in the news cycle, and would be inclined, the Queen judged, to hold his piece for a later issue, by which time the other three pillars would have crumbled and the story would lose, week by week, the urgency that had made it publishable in the first place, the editorial appetite. This was the most delicate of the four, and required the lightest touch, because to apply direct pressure to the magazine would be to confirm the story by the very pressure applied. What was needed was an indirect adjustment of the magazine's commercial situation, and the Queen had Madeleine pull the foreign publications file, which Madeleine had also not known existed, and which contained the household's notes on the financial backers and major advertisers of every European publication, with a circulation above 10,000, and from this file the Queen identified two advertisers, a Swiss luxury jeweller and a German automobile manufacturer, who between them accounted for nearly a fifth of the Zurich Weekly's annual advertising revenue, and both of whom had, by another small chain of relations, reasons to be sensitive to the wishes of figures connected, by however many removes, to the Estavian crown, and the Queen judged, after a long consideration, that no direct request need be made of either advertiser, that the existing relations between the magazine and its advertisers were sufficient, and that a single conversation between the senior secretary and a discreetly chosen member of the Estavian financial community on the Friday morning would result, by a route the Queen described to Madeleine in detail, and which Madeleine recorded, but will not detail here, in the magazine's editorial board being made aware over the weekend that a story of the kind in question, while of course commercially their own decision, would coincide unfortunately with a quarterly advertising review that was already underway. And the editorial board, like all editorial boards faced with such coincidences, would make the commercial calculation themselves, and would conclude, the Queen estimated with 70% confidence, that the story was not worth the quarterly review, and would defer it, and would then, with the other three pillars collapsing, never quite return to it, and the story would die not by suppression, but by simple, slow editorial neglect, which is how the most successful suppressions of such things invariably die, never by force, always by the patient removal of the supports that would have carried the story to the printing press. "That is the plan, Vaury," the Queen said, when the dictation was finished. "Read it back to me, Madeleine, read it back." The Queen made 3 small corrections, none of them substantive, all of them refinements of timing, and then said, "I am going to bring Lasset back in now and give it to him. I want you in the room when I do, because Lasset will need to see that you are part of this, that you will be running the secondary correspondence over the next 4 days, that he is not the only person who will know the whole of the plan, because Lasset has been frightened today, and frightened men in our work can break the plan by trying too hard, and I would like him to be reassured that the plan is being held by 2 minds rather than one, and that you and I have already considered each step, and that he is not the sole point of failure. Stay at the desk. Take notes during the meeting. Look composed. You are composed. I have watched you for an hour, and you have been composed throughout. But Lasset needs to see it, because Lasset is 62 and has not seen this side of you yet, and he will work better with you over the coming days if he has seen it now. Sit up. There he comes." The Comte de Lasset came back in, and the meeting took an hour and 40 minutes, and at the end of it the 4-part plan had been transferred to him as a set of operational tasks with timings and responsibilities, and Lasset, who had come in grey, left only slightly less grey, but with the particular steadiness of a senior man who has been given an actual plan rather than an emergency, and the work of the next 3 working days was set in motion within the hour, and the senior secretary did not see his bed for any meaningful period until the following Monday evening, and Madeleine worked through Friday and Saturday and Sunday almost as continuously, drafting and redrafting the secondary correspondence the plan required, the small letters to the watchmaker, and the unrelated letter to a friend at the French paper, and the carefully ordinary note to the household's Belgian intermediary. Each letter required to look like an ordinary piece of household business, so that none of them, if intercepted, would point to the operation, and the Queen reviewed every letter and corrected 3 of them, and the operation proceeded, hour by hour, across the long weekend, and Madeleine slept 4 hours on the Friday night, and 3 on the Saturday, and 2 on the Sunday, and on the Monday evening Lasset came into the writing room at 9:30, shaved and changed but looking like a man who had aged 2 years in 3 days, and reported. The source was confirmed. The Belgian lawyer had met Lambrechts on the Saturday morning. Lambrechts had understood the offer and accepted it within the hour, and would not be heard from again on this matter or any other, the lawyer's professional judgment being that the man had been visibly relieved to find his calculation correctly anticipated. The photograph was no longer available. The agency in Milan had withdrawn the license on the Tuesday afternoon as projected, and the magazine had been informed. The watchmaker's son's honour would be announced in the spring honours list as planned, and no quid pro quo would ever be discussed by anyone in the chain. The French paper was running its long-form profile of the Prince Consort and his charity work in its Wednesday edition, with 2 large photographs and a warm headline, which Madeleine had read in proof on the Sunday afternoon, and which was, she thought, perhaps overwarm by half a degree, but would do the work required. And the Advertiser's quarterly review had by the Monday morning produced in the magazine's editorial board the precise calculation the Queen had projected, and the story had been deferred, and the deputy editor of the magazine, a man whose opinion the senior secretary's informant in Zurich had been quietly soliciting all weekend, had told a colleague over Sunday lunch that the story was not quite ready, perhaps in the autumn, perhaps not at all, and the senior secretary's informant had reported the lunch on the Monday morning, and the story was now, by the senior secretary's professional judgment, 90% dead, and would be entirely dead by the end of the month. "Well done, Lasset," the Queen said. "Get some sleep. We shall not need you for 48 hours. Vaury, see that he is given the small green room for tonight, and that no one disturbs him until Wednesday morning. He is not to go to his own apartments. He will only work if he goes home. He is to sleep here under instruction. That is all, gentlemen." Lasset went, and Madeleine arranged the small green room and gave the necessary instructions to the underporters, and returned to the writing room, and the Queen was at the desk with the ledger open before her, and was making, in her own hand, the final entry on the matter, and Madeleine, watching her write, saw that the entry was very short. Zurich matter contained. Method confirmed for external threats. Plan to be kept on file for next occasion, which may come at any time. No celebration. We were lucky in the photographer's connections. Another agency would have required harder measures. Review the agency network map this autumn. And the Queen closed the ledger and looked up at Madeleine, who was standing in the middle of the room because she had not yet sat down again after returning from the green room, and the 2 women looked at each other for a long moment in the lamplit writing room at 10 on the Monday evening, and the Queen said, in a tone Madeleine had never heard from her before, in the 9 years they had worked together, a tone of pure exhaustion stripped of every register of management or strategy or the working voice. "It will not be the last one, Vaury. There will be another one, perhaps next year, perhaps in 5 years, perhaps in 15, and I shall sit at this desk and I shall do this again, and I shall do it again, and I shall do it for as long as I am Queen, and the work will not end with my husband's death, because the women already exist and will continue to surface, and the work will not end with my own death, because the historical interest will outlive me by decades, and the documents and the witnesses will surface across all those decades, and I have begun to understand, in the last 3 days, that I shall be doing this work until I die, and that the next Queen after me will need someone in her writing room who knows how the operation runs, and that I shall have to train her up to it the way Madame Charpentier trained me, and that the campaign has, in a sense I had not until tonight grasped, no end. It has only successes, and the question of whether it is worth the cost is a question I have not permitted myself to ask in 9 years, and which I find, tonight in this room with you, with no one else who would understand the question, I am asking, briefly, for the first time, and I am going to answer it, briefly, for the first and only time, and then I am going to put the question away and never ask it again, because the asking and the answering are themselves a luxury I cannot afford on a routine basis. And you, Vaury, are going to hear the answer, and you are going to hear it because you have earned it across 9 years and 3 days, and you are the only person in the world I would say this to, and after tonight we shall not speak of it again. Madeleine sat down, because her legs had begun to give a little, and waited. Yes, the Queen said. She did not elaborate. She said only the one word, and she said it with the level certainty of a woman who had been asking herself the question silently for 9 years, and had reached the answer long ago, and had simply not, until tonight, in this room, with this woman, allowed herself to articulate it. Yes, it is worth the cost. The cost is enormous, and it is mine, and I pay it knowingly, and it is worth paying, because the alternatives, every one of which I have examined more carefully than anyone living knows, are worse for the kingdom, and worse for the children, and worse, finally, for me, because the woman I would have to become to take any of the alternatives would be a woman I could not live with, and I would rather pay this cost as the woman I am than pay a different cost as a different woman. And that is the whole of the answer, and I have not earned the right to a more comforting one, and I would not want one, because a more comforting answer would mean I had not seen the cost clearly, and I have seen it clearly, and I pay it anyway, and that is the only kind of courage available to a woman in my position, and I have it, and I shall continue to have it until I die, and you will help me, Vaury, you will help me to the end, and we shall not speak of this again, and now I am going to bed, and you are going to bed, and tomorrow we shall be at the desk at the usual hour, and we shall begin again, and that is the whole of what I have to say to you tonight, and it is a great deal, and I hope I never have to say it again, and I thank you for being in this room, and good night. The Queen rose and went out, and Madeleine sat alone in the lamplit writing room at 10:30 on a Monday evening in June 1968, and did not move for a long while, and then she opened the ledger one last time, beneath the Queen's short closing entry on the Zurich matter, and wrote, in her own clear, careful hand, the single line that was the only entry she ever made in the ledger, that was not a record of operational fact, but a record of her own response to it, and that the Queen would read on the Tuesday morning and would not comment on, would only meet Madeleine's eye for half a second across the desk before turning to the morning's correspondence. The half-second the entire acknowledgment the matter received between them ever again, and the entry, which Madeleine's granddaughter would discover decades later when the ledger was finally unsealed for transcription, ran 25 June, 11 p.m. Operation successful. The Queen said yes. I also say yes. I follow her into this for the rest of my life. There. It is recorded the only time. Good night. The Prince Consort was, Madeleine came eventually to understand, the part of the campaign she had been deliberately kept furthest from, and the keeping had been the Queen's, and the reason was not, as Madeleine had at first assumed, that the Queen wished to protect a young lady-in-waiting from the unpleasantness of close contact with the man at the centre of the trouble, but the reverse, that the Queen wished to protect the man at the centre of the trouble from too much close contact with a young lady-in-waiting who had been given the whole arithmetic of his life. The Queen, Madeleine realized one evening in the spring of 1970, with the slow, uncomfortable clarity of a thing one has been not seeing for years, was protecting Prince Auguste from her, from Madeleine, from the cold complete knowledge Madeleine carried, because the Queen had decided, long ago, that no one in regular contact with her husband should know more about him than was strictly necessary for the work, and that Madeleine, knowing as much as she did, was a person who must be allowed to look upon him only at carefully managed angles, on carefully managed days, so that the look she might give him, the look of a woman who had recorded in a ledger 11 years of his lovers and the various costs of them, would not, by some accidental crossing of his attention in a corridor, register on him as the look it was. The Queen had been managing that crossing for a decade. Madeleine had not noticed she was being managed. That was the depth of the management. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. She noticed when she was finally, by an oversight on the part of one of the equerries, placed in a small drawing room alone with the Prince Consort for 11 minutes on a Wednesday morning in March 1970, and learned, in the course of those 11 minutes, more about the man than she had learned from 11 years of the ledger, and learned also, in the same 11 minutes, what the Queen had been protecting him from her seeing, and was, at the end of them, considerably shaken, in a way she had not been shaken since the edge of the bed in 1959, and went straight from the drawing-room to the writing-room and asked the Queen to receive her. And the Queen, who had heard within the half-hour from a stricken equerry that the placement had occurred, looked up from her desk and said, before Madeleine could speak, "Yes, Vaury. Come in, sit down, not angry. I am only sorry it has happened, because I had hoped to spare you this for at least another 5 years. Sit down and tell me what you saw." What Madeleine had seen was a man of 48, in good health and good clothes, who had walked into the drawing-room expecting a senior staff officer for a briefing about a regimental visit, and who had found instead a lady-in-waiting whose name he was not sure of, and whose presence in the room he could not immediately account for, and who had, in the small social embarrassment of the moment, fallen back upon a charm so practiced and so automatic that Madeleine had recognized it within the first sentence as not charm at all, in any human sense, but a kind of professional reflex of the personality, a thing applied to the air of any room he entered the way other men applied cologne, indiscriminately, with no consciousness of the woman opposite as a particular person, only as a generic occasion for the charm to be exercised upon. And Madeleine had stood with her face composed, and her hands folded, and had watched the Prince Consort of Estavia turn upon her, a perfect stranger, the same warm sideways smile, and the same slightly tilted listening posture, and the same small flattering pause before each reply that he had turned upon, presumably, every woman he had ever spoken to alone, including, 12 years before, Helene Vasari at the Opera Ball, and including, 4 years before, Elisabeth Vondry at the Charente weekend, and the charm was so completely undifferentiated, so totally without any sense of who Madeleine actually was, or what she might be in the room for, that Madeleine had understood, with a cold clarity that took her by surprise, that the man's affairs were not, had never been, in any meaningful sense about the women he had them with, that the women were the contingent occasions for a need located entirely in him, that he had not even, after 12 years of an arrangement that had defined her professional life, been told her name was Vaury, or had been told and had not retained it, and that this incuriosity, this absolute absence of any interest in the particular human beings on the other side of his charm, was the deepest fact of the man, and that all the elaborate work the household had done for 14 years had been done around a void at the centre of the kingdom, a man who was not malicious, was not cruel, was not even, strictly, lustful in any vivid sense that would have made him a more comprehensible figure, but was in the way some men are, simply, evenly, comprehensively, uninterested in other human beings as anything but mirrors for his own continuing performance of himself, and that this incuriosity, which his looks and his charm and his rank had permitted him to live with for 48 years, without ever being challenged, was the actual engine of the whole disaster, that he took women because taking women was the form his hollow centre took, that he would have taken something else in another life, gambling perhaps, or drink, but that women had been available, and the kingdom had not stopped him, and so it had been women, and that the kingdom had not stopped him. Madeleine understood standing in the small drawing-room at the end of his 11th minute of charm, because the woman charged with stopping him had decided long ago that he could not be stopped, that the void was permanent, and that the only available course was to manage around it for the rest of his life and hers. Madeleine told the Queen the whole of this, in the writing-room, in plain words, in perhaps 6 minutes, and the Queen listened with her face very still, and when Madeleine was finished the Queen said, "Yes, Vaury, that is what I have been keeping you from seeing. Now you have seen it. I had hoped to keep you from seeing it for longer." because the seeing is a particular kind of weight that I have not wished to lay on you on top of all the others, and because I had thought it might be possible, with sufficient management, to allow you to continue the work without ever quite confronting the man at its centre as a human absence rather than a human problem. A human problem is bearable to manage, because a problem implies a solution one could in principle imagine. A human absence is harder to manage, because there is no solution, only the daily accommodation of the empty space the absence creates. I have lived with the absence for 16 years, and I have, I think, made my peace with it, but the peace was hard-won, and required me to redefine, in private, what I had once thought a marriage was, and I had hoped to spare you that redefinition, which I do not believe you have yet quite made for your own future life, and which you will now perhaps have to make sooner than you would have if you had not stood in that drawing-room this morning. I am sorry. I am specifically sorry for that, because the seeing is a small irreversible damage to one's general view of human beings, and you have, by an equerry's oversight, taken it some years before you would otherwise have had to. I cannot undo it. I can only ask you, since it is done, to bring it into the work, because the work will be the better for your having seen it directly, however much I would have preferred you saw it later, or not at all. The Queen rose from the desk and walked to the window, the way she walked to the window when working through the hardest material. I am going to tell you something I have not told anyone, Vaury, and I am going to tell you because you will now begin to understand it on your own, and I would rather be the one who tells you than have you arrive at it through your own deductions, which would take you another year, and would in that year alter your view of me in ways I cannot fully predict, and I would rather we go through the alteration together now than separately over the coming months. The man you saw in the drawing-room this morning is not a man I despise. That is the first thing. I think, when people imagine my position, they imagine a wife who has come over the years to despise the husband who has so publicly used her, and this is the picture the kingdom carries of me and the picture I let the kingdom carry. Because the picture is useful, it allows the kingdom to feel sorry for me in a way that does not destabilize the throne, and a useful picture I do not correct. But it is not what I feel. I do not despise him. To despise him would imply that I had once expected something from him that he failed to provide, and the truth is that I understood the shape of him within 6 months of the marriage. Before any of the women, before any of the trouble, when he was still being charming to me in exactly the manner you observed this morning, and I understood, as you understood within 11 minutes, that the charm was not for me, was not for anyone, was simply the form his absence took, and I sat with that understanding for the next year and a half, alone, before I made my long night decision in the second year, and the decision I made was not the decision of a wife who has been wronged. It was the decision of a woman who had been given, by accident of state and by the constitutional impossibility of refusing the match her uncle had arranged, a man with an absence at the centre of him, and who had to decide what to do with the man. And I decided, Vaury, I decided that I would treat him the way one treats a great house with a serious structural fault that one has inherited and cannot sell and cannot in honour abandon. One does not despise such a house. One does not love it either, in the simple sense. One assumes responsibility for it. One props the wall that wants to fall. One reroutes the water that wants to come in through the cracked roof. One accepts that certain rooms will never be habitable in the way other rooms in other houses are habitable, and one lives in the rooms that remain, and one does this for the whole of one's life, because one is the only person in a position to do it, and because the alternative, the public condemnation of the house, the lawsuit against the builders, the loud abandonment of it, would be a worse outcome than the patient daily maintenance, would harm the children who live in the house, would harm the staff who work in it, would harm the kingdom that gathers in its halls. And so one stays, and one props, and one reroutes, and one accepts. That is what I have done with the man you saw this morning. Not despise, manage, the way an honourable inheritor manages a flawed inheritance. And I want you to understand, Vaury, that this is not a euphemism for despising him, that I have looked very carefully at my own heart on this matter over many years, and that I do not in fact despise him, that the absence at the centre of him is, finally, more pitiable than contemptible, that he did not make himself this way, that he was made this way by a childhood his own mother described to me once in plain words at a state dinner in 1958, before she died, in a confidence I have never repeated, and that I came away from that dinner with a small grain of pity for him that I have never lost, and that has in fact grown over the years, and that the pity is, I think, the actual emotional fact of my marriage, not despite and not love, but pity, a steady, undramatic adult pity, and that this is not an admission I would make to anyone but you, because the kingdom requires that I appear to feel either wronged or loyal, and the truth, which is that I feel sorry for him in a way that is closer to how one feels sorry for a difficult child than how one feels sorry for a husband, would be incomprehensible to the kingdom and useful to no one, and so I keep it. But I keep it consciously, and I want at least one other person, in this room, in this hour, to know that I keep it. Because the keeping of even private feelings entirely alone, Vaury, is a thing that begins over the years to make and one wonder whether one feels them at all. And I have come to think that the most lonely thing about my position is not the public silence, but the private silence. The having no one with whom to confirm that one's own inner life is in fact the shape one believes it to be, and I have decided this morning, on hearing what the equerry did, and on receiving you here, that I will not bear that loneliness any longer in this particular respect, that you will know the shape of my feeling for the man, and that you will not refer to it again, and that the knowing will simply sit between us as a fact about me that you have, and that I will be a little less alone for your having it, and that this, Vaury, this small unsentimental act of telling, is perhaps the largest concession to my own loneliness I have made in 11 years, and I am making it because I trust you, and because the equerry's mistake has, in the inscrutable way such things sometimes do, opened a door I would not have opened deliberately, and I am walking through it once, with you, and we will close it behind us, and we will not open it again, and that is the whole of what I want to say. The Queen turned from the window. Now Vaury the work, the morning's correspondence, and Madeleine, who had sat through the speech with her face composed, and her ledger closed and her hands folded in her lap, and who had felt, somewhere around the 3rd minute of it, a slow heavy fullness rise in her chest of the kind one feels when receiving a confidence that will change the shape of one's life, and that one cannot, by the terms of the relationship in which it is given, acknowledge by any visible gesture. Madeleine inclined her head once, the small movement that across 11 years had become their shared sign for received and understood and held, and rose, and went to the table where the morning's correspondence was waiting, and opened the first letter, and began to read it aloud to the Queen in the level voice the work required, and the Queen listened, and made her marginal notes, and the day proceeded, and neither woman ever, in the remaining 27 years of their work together, referred to the Wednesday morning in March 1970 again, and the door was closed, as the Queen had said it would be, and the knowing sat between them, as the Queen had said it would, a fact about her that Madeleine carried for the rest of her life, and that Madeleine wrote down at last, dictating it to her granddaughter at 90, as the deepest single human revelation the manuscript contained, the Queen of Estavia's actual, private, unspoken feeling for the man she had married, which was pity, steady adult pity, of the kind one extends to a difficult child, or a beloved inherited house with a structural fault, and which Madeleine, 88 at the time of writing, identified as the most surprising emotional discovery of her professional life, because it had not occurred to her in 1970, and it had not occurred to her in 1980, and it had not occurred to her until quite recently, in old age, that the Queen had been telling her, that Wednesday morning, not only about the Prince Consort, but about a more general fact of life, that Madeleine had not yet learned at 34, and would only finally understand at 80, which was that the most exhausting and the most honourable response a person can have to the difficult human beings they are bound to is not love, and not hate, and not management in the cold sense, but pity, the steady acknowledgement of the absence at the centre of the other, the propping of the wall that wants to fall, the daily accommodation of the empty rooms, and that this kind of pity, properly understood, is the highest form of marriage available to women in positions where the conventional forms have collapsed, and that Queen Sophia had been practicing it, alone and unconfirmed, for 40 years, and that Madeleine, watching, had been receiving an education in it, without recognizing at the time that an education was being delivered, and that the education had shaped her own long unmarried life more thoroughly than any of the more obvious lessons of the court, because Madeleine, in her own quiet way, had become a woman who pitied, calmly, the various human absences she had encountered across her decades, the cousins and the colleagues and the difficult relatives, and had propped their walls and rerouted their water and lived in the habitable rooms of those relationships without bitterness and without illusion, and had learned this art from the woman she served, in a writing room, on a Wednesday morning in March 1970, when an equerry made a mistake, and the prince consort was charming to a stranger for 11 minutes, and the door opened briefly, and the Queen, in her one great violation of her own discipline in a long life of discipline, walked through it with her, and said the things one is not, in such a life, supposed to say, and then closed the door behind them, and never opened it again, and went back to the morning's correspondence, and so did Madeleine, who carried what she had been given, faithfully for the next 27 years, into the long quiet afternoons that followed, and into the late summer of 1971, when the door opened again, not by anyone's choice this time, but by the force of events, and the calculation came within a single breath of breaking. And what we have been moving toward across these 5 parts is, at last, in the part that follows, what happened on that afternoon. The afternoon in question was the 18th of August 1971, a Wednesday, and it was very hot, and Madeleine remembered the heat afterward more clearly than almost any other detail of the day, because the heat had been part of the breaking, had loosened something in the air of the writing room that on a cooler day might have held, and Madeleine, who had spent 12 years by then learning that great moments in the household occurred under circumstances no one would ever have predicted, was struck by how much the most consequential afternoon of her professional life depended, in the end, on the simple physical fact that the summer of 1971 was the hottest the kingdom had known in 40 years, and that the writing room, which faced south, was by 3 in the afternoon the temperature of a glasshouse, and that the Queen, who had been answering correspondence since 10, was, by 3, in a condition Madeleine had never before observed in her, the condition of a woman whose careful daily defences had been worn slightly thin by physical discomfort, the way a knife edge thins on a soft stone, and that this thinning, combined with what was about to come through the door, was what produced the breaking. What came through the door was a young woman of 26, in a pale blue dress, with hair so fair it was almost white in the south light, who was announced by the under-porter as Mademoiselle Cecile Bauer, and who had been admitted to the palace that afternoon on the strength of a letter of introduction from a senior member of the cabinet, the foreign minister himself, who had written to the Queen's private secretariat the previous week in terms so peculiar, so insistent on the Queen's receiving the young woman personally, and yet so vague about the substance of what the young woman wished to communicate, that the senior secretary, Lassay, had spent 2 days deciding how to handle the request, and had finally placed it before the Queen with a note attached saying, "I cannot read this. It is irregular. I think the minister means it kindly, and I think there is something he is not saying. Your Majesty's instinct will judge better than mine. Decide as you wish." The Queen had read the note and the letter and had said, "I will see her. Make it a private audience. Vaury will be present. The afternoon of the 18th. Brief." Mademoiselle Bauer was, by the household's preparatory inquiries, the daughter of a Bauer who had been a junior aide to the Prince Consort during a state visit to Vienna 18 months before, and was now studying at the Conservatoire in the capital, and had, the inquiries had not been able fully to establish, perhaps developed some attachment to the Prince during a series of receptions in the spring, and was, the foreign minister's letter implied without saying, in a delicate situation that required the Queen's personal consideration. Madeleine had assembled the picture for the Queen on the Tuesday evening, and the Queen had received it with the small nod that meant the picture was incomplete and that the completion would be obtained from the young woman in the room. Mademoiselle Bauer arrived at 3 in the afternoon. The thermometer in the writing room stood at 29. She was, when she came in, very young. That was what Madeleine, watching her enter, registered first, before her clothes and before her bearing and before the small flush of nerves on her pale neck. She was 26, not in the conventional sense in which most women of 26 are women, but in the more particular sense of being a person upon whom adult experience had not yet inscribed any deep mark, who walked into the writing room of the Queen of Estavia the way a girl of 19 walks into a first ball, with that mixture of stiffening pride and naked expectation that the experienced people in the room could read at a glance, and that would, Madeleine thought, with the small cold preliminary recognition the work had trained into her, mean within the next 40 minutes that one of two things was about to happen, and that both of them were going to be more difficult than the senior secretary had foreseen. Either, Madeleine thought, this young woman has come to deliver the standard kind of news that women in her situation occasionally delivered to senior officials, the kind that produced the standard kind of household response, the discreet provision and the discreet farewell and the addition of an entry to the ledger, and her youth was simply the explanation for the irregularity of the channel by which she had come, the foreign minister having taken pity on a girl too inexperienced to know the proper routes, or else she had come to deliver something else, something the foreign minister himself had not fully understood, and had passed up the chain in the hope that the Queen would understand it where he had not. And the something else, Madeleine thought, watching the girl curtsy and approach the desk with the wrong number of small bobbing steps that no one had quite trained out of her, was going to be the kind of news that the household, in 12 years, had not yet faced, and that the Queen had been preparing for, in the secret architecture of her mind, for the whole of the campaign, the one branch of the contingency tree the Queen never spoke of, and that Madeleine had only ever seen referred to obliquely in a single marginal note in the ledger from 1964, "Consider preparations for the matter of a child," a note which had never been followed up on the page, and which Madeleine had, until this afternoon, half believed the Queen had decided to leave unaddressed, on the strategic judgment that the matter would, if it came, come in its own way, and could not usefully be prepared for in advance. Mademoiselle Vaury reached the desk and curtsied once more deeper. The Queen, who had risen for her, sat again and gestured to the small upright chair on the visitor's side of the desk, and Mademoiselle Vaury sat and arranged her hands in her lap with the careful neatness of a girl who had been told, possibly that morning by her mother, that the hands must be neat in such an audience, and looked up at the Queen with an expression Madeleine, even after 12 years, could only describe as terribly, terribly young, and the Queen looked back at her, and the audience began. It went on for 42 minutes. Madeleine, at the side desk, took shorthand notes of the kind that would not become a record, but would assist her in helping the Queen reconstruct the conversation afterward, and the notes she took on that day were, when she transcribed them into the ledger the following morning, the most carefully written she had ever produced, and she would refer to them many times across the next 26 years, and they began as she wrote them out in longhand. Mademoiselle B expressed her great honour at being received. Q acknowledged. B asked whether she might speak with great frankness, the matter being of considerable delicacy, and not, she had been advised by the minister, suitable for any other channel. Q assented. MLB said that she had been employed, during the previous spring, as a junior interpreter on the occasion of certain receptions, and had had the honour of speaking on those occasions with His Royal Highness the Prince Consort, and that His Royal Highness had been most courteous to her, and that subsequent to the receptions she had received from His Royal Highness, through an intermediary, certain communications of a personal nature. Q listened. It was, Madeleine wrote later, the slowest beginning to such a conversation she had ever transcribed. The girl was approaching the substance by a long, careful path that Madeleine recognized as the path of a person who had rehearsed the opening sentences with someone, possibly the minister, and had not rehearsed the rest, and was making her way forward without a script, and was therefore taking it very slowly. And the Queen, who had also recognized this, gave her the room to take it slowly, and asked no question that would hurry her. And the audience, in those first minutes, had the quality of a procession down a long corridor that everyone in the room understood was going to end in a single specific door, and that no one would name until the door was reached. The door, when it was reached at the 23rd minute. Mademoiselle Vaury, who had by then progressed through the spring receptions and the personal communications and a private supper at a house in the country that had been arranged through the same intermediary, and had described, in the level patient prose of a young woman who had clearly been told that she must on no account become emotional, during the audience, what had transpired between herself and the Prince over a period of 3 months, said, in a voice that was steady but had thinned a little, "I am, ma'am, very sorry to say to your Majesty, and I would not say it had I any other course, that I am with child, by His Royal Highness, and the date can only be the 7th of May, which was the night of the supper at the house in the country, and which is, I have been advised by a physician, consistent with my present condition. I have come to your Majesty because my father is dead and my mother is not well, and the foreign minister advised me there was no one else who could properly hear this, and I have not, ma'am, asked anything in writing, and I am not asking anything now, only that your Majesty be informed, because it seemed to me that your Majesty must be the first to know it, before any decision was taken about anything by anyone." She stopped. She had not wept. She had, in fact, finished her sentences with a small dignified completeness that Madeleine, listening, recognized as the great achievement of a person operating well beyond her experience, and the writing-room was, for a moment, very quiet, and the heat hung in the air, and Madeleine, with her pen poised over the shorthand, did not look up from the page, because she understood that the moment did not require any face from her, only the continuation of the recording, and the Queen, on her side of the desk, was silent for what Madeleine afterward calculated as 9 seconds, which was the longest silence the Queen had ever produced in a private audience in Madeleine's hearing. And at the end of the 9 seconds the Queen said, in the level voice, "Thank you for telling me. You have done it as well as it can be done, and I should like you to know that, because it will matter to you later, that you came to me with dignity. And you have. I am going to ask you to sit with my lady-in-waiting in the next room for 1/4 of an hour, while I think. There will be tea brought to you. You will please not speak to anyone, including the servants who bring the tea. At the end of the 1/4 of an hour, I shall ask you back. Is that acceptable, Mademoiselle Bauer?" The girl said it was acceptable. Madeleine rose and led her through to the small green room, and rang for the tea and gave the necessary instructions to the maid who came, and saw the girl seated by the window with her hands folded as neatly in her lap as they had been at the desk, and returned to the writing-room and closed the door behind her. And the Queen had not moved from her chair, was sitting exactly as she had been sitting when Mademoiselle Bauer had finished her sentence, and Madeleine came to the side desk and sat, and did not speak, because she understood that the Queen was thinking and was not yet to be addressed. The Queen sat for a long time. The clock on the mantel ticked. The heat in the writing-room pressed against the long curtains, and then the Queen said, in a voice that was not the level voice. That was a voice Madeleine had heard once before, in the green-room conversation about the Prince Consort the year before, the private voice the Queen permitted herself, perhaps 3 times in a decade, the voice that was Sophia without the Queen, Vaury. "I have to tell you something, and I have to tell you in this hour, because I am about to make a decision that may not be the right one, and I would rather you have heard the alternative before I decide, in case the decision is wrong, in case you should later have to know that I did consider the alternative and rejected it, and not assume that I never considered it at all. I am sitting here, Vaury, with the strongest impulse I have had in 18 years of marriage, to end the marriage, not because of the child. The child is no worse, in the abstract, than the singers and the wives. The child is the standard outcome the actuary in my mind told me to expect at some point across the decades, and the actuary was right, and the child can be handled, as the singers and the wives have been handled, by money and arrangement and the patient long management we have built up the capacity for. That is not what I am sitting here with. I am sitting here with the impulse to end it because of the girl, because she came into this room, and she is 26, and she is fair, and she sat where she sat with her hands neat, and she had clearly been told by some adult that she must be brave in this audience, and she was brave, exactly as instructed, and her father is dead, and her mother is unwell, and she has been brought into the centre of the matter we have spent 14 years not naming, and she has done it with more dignity than any of the previous ones, and I have been sitting here, Vaury, for the last few minutes, looking at that closed door behind which she is now sitting having tea, and I have been considering, for the first time in my reign, whether the price I have been making the kingdom and the household, and that young woman and the previous young women, and Madame Vaury, and Madame Vasari, and yourself, Vaury, and most of all the woman who is sitting at this desk, whether the price I have been making all of us pay for the discretion is in fact a price that ought to be paid, or whether I have been wrong, Vaury, wrong for 18 years, wrong for the whole of my marriage, wrong in the long night decision at 24, and whether the right thing, the actually right thing, the thing a woman with my access and my powers and my willingness to bear public cost could in fact do this afternoon, is to walk out of this room and summon the senior officers of state and tell them that I will be petitioning for a dissolution of my marriage on grounds of my husband's adultery, named, dated, with the present case as the catalyst and Mademoiselle Bauer as one of several named co-respondents. And let the constitutional crisis come, and let the public know, and let the children suffer the consequences, and let the whole 30-year machinery of the silence collapse around us. Because, Vaury, because I am tired, and the girl behind that door is 26 and pregnant and brave, and there is going to be another girl after her, and another, until I die, and I have, sitting here in the heat in this room, lost, for one specific stretch of perhaps 4 minutes, my belief that the continued protection of the kingdom is worth the continued protection of the man, and the belief has been the foundation of the campaign, and the foundation has, in the last 4 minutes, cracked, and I am sitting here on the cracked foundation, and I have a quarter of an hour to decide whether the crack will widen or close, and I am telling you because I need to say it aloud to someone, once, in the cracked condition, before I close it or widen it, so that you will know that I considered it. I considered it. For the first and only time in my life as queen, I consider ending it. Do you understand, Vaury, what I am telling you? Madeleine understood. She had heard the queen speak in the private voice twice now, the previous and this afternoon, and the second time the private voice was saying a thing of such an entirely different order from the first, that Madeleine, who had thought she had reached the bottom of her capacity to be moved by anything the queen said, found that she had not, and felt rise in her the same fullness she had felt the year before, the slow, heavy human fullness that exceeded the form of the room, and she set down her pen, deliberately, the only time in 12 years she had set down her pen during a working hour in the writing room, and looked across at the queen, and said, in the level voice she had spent 12 years cultivating, and which was, now the only voice the queen could afford to be answered in even in this hour, because anything less level would have hurried the decision, and the decision must not be hurried. I understand, ma'am. I want to say only one thing, and then I will be silent, because the decision is yours and not mine, and must not be shaped by me. The thing is this. You have, ma'am, in 18 years, never confused the kingdom's interest with your husband's interest. You have always known the two were different, and have served the first, while declining to be sentimental about the second. You said it to me in this room in 1959, before I understood what you meant. The kingdom is what the protection is for, not him. If you are sitting here today and considering whether the kingdom would now be better served by the public collapse of the silence than by its continuation, that is a question I am not competent to answer, and it is also, ma'am, a question you have not, in 18 years, asked yourself for any reason that arose from anywhere outside this room. You have asked it today because of a young woman who is 26 and brave and is sitting in the next room. That is not the kingdom's interest, ma'am. That is your own private moral response to a particular young woman whose courage has moved you, and you are entitled to be moved by it, and I think a person who was not moved by it would be a worse queen than you are. But the question of whether the kingdom's interest has changed is a question that must be asked separately from the question of whether Mademoiselle Bauer has been brave. Because if the kingdom's interest has in fact not changed, ma'am, then the right course is the course you have been on for 18 years, and the brave young woman in the next room must be treated as we have treated the others, with care and with money and with the patient long arrangement, and the cost of her bravery will be paid by her, as the costs of the previous ones were paid by them, and I will help you pay her her share of it, ma'am, as honestly as we paid the others theirs. and that is the work, and the work has not changed. Even though the moment has been hard, and even though we are both, ma'am, in this hour, tired, and even though the girl is 26, and even though the heat is very great. That is the one thing I want to say, ma'am, and now I will be silent." The Queen did not speak for a long moment. "Vaury," she said at last, "you have done me in those 4 minutes the greatest service of your service. You have given me back the question. You have separated, with great precision, the moral and the strategic, which I had let collapse together under the pressure of the heat and the girl and the years, and you have laid them out for me cleanly. And I see now that the moral question, the one about Mademoiselle Bauer, has an answer which I will work out separately in the next 10 minutes, and the strategic question, the one about the kingdom, has the same answer it has had for 18 years, which is that the kingdom is not better served by the public collapse. The two questions had got tangled because I am tired, and I had let them tangle because the heat had loosened my grip, and you have untangled them for me, and I will, in consequence, not be making the decision I was considering. The marriage will continue, the campaign will continue, the kingdom will continue, and Mademoiselle Bauer, who has done nothing wrong and a great deal right, will be helped, as we have helped the others, perhaps more generously than the others, because she is the youngest of them, and her bravery deserves an answering generosity from us, and you and I will design the help in the coming days, and we will get it right, because we are good at this work and we have done it before, and the foundation has not cracked, Vaury. It had only, for a few minutes, been warm. It is cool again now, thank you." She went to the small bell-pull beside the fireplace. She paused with her hand on it. "You may write down, Vaury, in the ledger tonight, the briefest possible note. You may write, 'The Queen considered, on the afternoon of the 18th of August 1971, the public ending of her marriage, and decided against it on the grounds correctly identified by the lady-in-waiting present, and the decision is final.' You may write that, no more, no surrounding sentences, no emotional record, just that, so that when this ledger is one day burned, as I have asked you to burn it, the line will go with it, and the only people who ever knew that this afternoon happened will be you and me in the line, and the line will burn, and the knowing will be yours alone after I am gone. And that, Vaury, that is now your work as well, the carrying of this single fact about me alone after my death, for as long as you live. Will you carry it?" "I will carry it, ma'am." "Then we shall bring her back in, and we shall be very kind to her, and we shall begin the next part of the work, which is hers, and we shall do it well." The Queen pulled the bell-pull. The maid came. Mademoiselle Bauer was fetched from the green room. Tea was brought, fresh, because the afternoon had moved on, and the Queen wished the new conversation to begin in a new register, and Mademoiselle Bauer, sitting again in the upright chair, was treated for the next half-hour with a kindness so steady and so total that, she would, Madeleine learned years later, remember it for the rest of her life as the experience that, more than any other in her young difficult year, allowed her to believe she would survive, and the arrangements were made, and the foreign minister was instructed, and the child was born the following spring in a country whose name will not appear in this telling, because Madeleine kept that detail out of even her own manuscript, and the child grew up in a kind and quiet household, with adoptive parents the household had selected with extraordinary care, and Mademoiselle Bauer herself was provided for with a sum that allowed her to leave the conservatoire and travel, and eventually to marry, in 1975, a Swiss doctor of considerable goodness, and the matter was contained, and the campaign held, and the kingdom did not know, and the foundation, which had been warm for 4 minutes on a Wednesday afternoon in August 1971, was cool again by Thursday morning, and Madeleine wrote the brief line into the ledger that evening, exactly as the Queen had instructed. No surrounding sentences, no emotional record, the single fact and nothing else, and went on, and the work went on, and the years went on, and the foundation held, and held and held, and would hold until the very last year of Sophia of Estavia's reign, and held even then, and only finally broke after she had died, which is the part of the story we are not yet at, and which we will reach in the parts that follow. But the breaking, when it came after her, and during her life she never permitted it, and that one afternoon in August 1971 was the closest she ever came, and Madeleine carried the knowing of it, faithfully, for the next 26 years, and dictated it at last to her granddaughter, weeping for the third time in the long telling of her life, weeping not for the Queen, and not for Mademoiselle Vaury, and not for herself, but for the single specific 4 minutes in a hot room in 1971, in which the most disciplined woman she had ever known had lost her grip on her own discipline, and had told her so, and had recovered it, and had gone on, and had carried the small private fact of that loss of grip into her grave, and had asked Madeleine to carry it after her, and Madeleine had carried it, and was now at 90, finally, with the Queen long dead, and the kingdom changed, and the manuscript before her, setting it down in plain words, the last secret of Sophia of Estavia, which was not anything her husband had done but a single afternoon of her own, in a writing room in 1971, when she had nearly chosen otherwise and had not, and had been a queen instead, for another 26 years, alone, and had known, every day of those 26 years, that she had nearly chosen otherwise, and had carried that knowing in the room behind every public smile, and had told only one person in her life that she had carried it, and that person had been Madeleine Vaury, and Madeleine Vaury was now telling the world, at last, in the only way that did not betray her, after they were all dead, in plain words, with the gravity the moment had deserved, and that the kingdom had been spared at the cost of one young woman's bravery, and one queen's recovered discipline, and one lady-in-waiting's 4-minute speech across a desk, in a glass-house room on the 18th of August 1971. The years after the August afternoon were quieter, which was an effect Madeleine had not foreseen, and which the Queen had, and which the Queen explained to Madeleine over a small private tea in the writing room in the spring of 1973, 18 months after the Vaury matter had been fully settled, and Mademoiselle Vaury had been quietly married to her Swiss doctor in a village outside Lausanne, with the household discreetly informed of the date and the household's small private wedding gift, discreetly delivered through the foreign minister's wife as a personal kindness having nothing to do with anyone, the gift being a set of table linen of the kind a young bride sets up house with, and not the kind a former mistress receives in compensation, the distinction being one the Queen had spent a long evening with Madeleine perfecting in the late winter of 1972, because the Queen had judged that Mademoiselle Vaury must on no account be made to feel, at the start of her actual life, that her actual life had been paid for, and so the linen, which Madeleine had selected herself from a workshop in the south of the kingdom, was of a quality just slightly above what the Queen normally sent for such occasions, but not so much above as to advertise itself, the Queen having said, "Give her the linen a queen sends to the doctor's bride next door, not the linen a queen sends to a former mistress." And the difference, Vaury, is in the embroidery, 3 flowers instead of 4, and you will know it when you see it, and Madeleine had known it, and had bought it, and had sent it, and Mademoiselle Vaury's letter of thanks had come back in due course, addressed correctly to Her Majesty, with no shading in it that suggested the writer remembered ever having sat in an upright chair in a writing room in August 1971, the Queen's instruction having been internalized by Mademoiselle Vaury perfectly, and the matter being, by the Queen's reckoning, fully and properly concluded, Vaury, and an example of how such things may end, when both parties have the sense to allow them to, and the file having been closed on the Vaury matter, with that note in the Queen's hand, and the file having been moved to the storage room where the closed files lived, behind the active ones, in the order of their conclusion, the Queen's archive of her own quiet war. The quietness the Queen explained over the tea in 1973 was real and was likely to last. The Prince Consort, who was now 51, had been quietly observed by the household across the 18 months since the Vaury matter, and had not, by the household's careful monitoring, begun a new attachment of the kind that produced the work for the writing room. There had been, the household was aware, small incidents on country weekends, the kind that had been the texture of the prince's life since the second year of the marriage, and that produced no consequence for the campaign, because they produced no consequence for the women, who passed through and were not heard from again. But the larger pattern of the sustained attachment, the kind that produced ledger entries and letters to opera directors, and 11-year parallel campaigns for the better self, had not, since 1971, recurred. Madame Vaury's affair was still ongoing, the slow, steady self-injury continuing in its quiet way, and would continue for another 4 years. But Madame Vaury was, by 1973, almost a closed matter in the operational sense, requiring only the maintenance correspondence of the philosophy letters and the occasional small intervention in M. Vaury's diplomatic career to keep him stationed where the affair was geographically containable, and the household had absorbed this routine. The new attachment, the one that would have replaced Madame Vaury as the active case, had not appeared. The prince consort, the queen judged, had perhaps received some private intimation of the August afternoon. Not the substance of it, of course. No one outside the writing room had ever known the substance, but some shift in the air around his wife since that afternoon, some small change in the temperature of the household, some unexplained pause that he had noticed in the way men of his kind notice such things without quite registering what they have noticed, and had moderated himself accordingly without any conscious decision to do so, and the moderation had held for 18 months, and might hold for years, or might not. But the Queen was inclined to think, on the strength of her long observation of him, that the moderation was a permanent partial settling rather than a temporary pause, that something in him had quieted as he passed 50, and that the work of the writing room would, accordingly, have a long fallow stretch ahead of it, during which the campaign would maintain its existing files and watch for new ones, but would not perhaps originate new major operations for some years. "You will find this difficult, Vaury," the Queen said over the tea, "more difficult than the busy years, and I want to prepare you, because most women in your position would not be prepared, and the lack of preparation would do them harm. The busy years have given you a structure for your professional life that I think you have come to rely on more than you have realized. The daily strategic work, the regular crises, the sense of an enemy and a campaign and a forward movement. And a quiet period in this work is not, as one might think, a rest. It is a different and harder condition, in which one continues to hold the readiness for the work without having the work to apply it to. And one finds oneself sitting in the writing room with no letter to draft and no operation to manage, and the years passing, and one begins, if one is not careful, to consider whether one's life has been worth the effort one has put into being ready for crises that no longer come, and one can, in such a quiet stretch, lose one's footing in a way that the busy years protect one from, because the busy years do not give one the time to consider whether anything has been worth the effort. They only give one the next operation, and the considering is postponed, perhaps for decades. We are entering, Vaury, the considering years, and you will need to find, in the quiet, the things that make your private life sustainable in the absence of the constant occupation. Because I have used your professional self very thoroughly for the past 14 years, and I have a duty in this quieter stretch to remind you that you are also a private woman, and that you have come to 37 years of age in this room, and that the room has, while you were doing your excellent work in it, become very nearly the whole of your life, and that I have benefited from this, and have done nothing to discourage it, which is a thing I will name now, in 1973, because it is the only honest thing to do, and you may, knowing it, decide differently about the remaining years." Madeleine was, as ever, quiet in her face, but she felt the small heavy fullness rise again, the third or fourth time the Queen had occasioned it in her, and she found, looking back across the 18 months since the Bower afternoon, that the Queen was right, that the months had passed without the structure of urgent work, and that Madeleine had spent them in a state she had not, until this moment, named to herself, the state of a woman who has been a senior officer in a quiet war for 14 years, and who, in a stretch of peace, discovers that she does not know what to do with her own evenings, that her own family in the provinces has receded to a relation conducted entirely by letters at Easter and Christmas, that her 2 surviving sisters have married and have children Madeleine does not really know, and have grown into women whose lives Madeleine cannot, when she visits them once a year, fully follow, because the second conversation she lives in has trained her into a vocabulary they do not share, and her habit of careful listening has, on those visits, the effect of making her sisters feel she is studying them, rather than being with them, that her 1 or 2 acquaintances at the court of her own age have either married and left the household, or married and remained in it, and shifted, after marriage, to a register of professional friendliness that did not extend to evenings, that the small flat she keeps in a quiet street near the palace is, when she returns to it at the end of the working days, very quiet, and that the quietness, which had not bothered her in the busy years because it had felt like rest, was beginning, in the considering years, to feel like something else, like the inside of a room she had been preparing, without noticing she was preparing it, the narrow house Madame Charpentier had warned her about in 1959. The narrow house Madeleine had agreed to take on without quite understanding the agreement, and she had moved into it without ever quite signing a lease, by the steady cumulative work of 14 years, and was now living in it, alone, with the door closed behind her, and the Queen across the tea-table was, with great kindness and great honesty, naming the house she had let Madeleine move into. "I have brought you here today, Vaury," the Queen said, "to suggest something to you, and you may receive the suggestion or decline it as you see fit. There is a young woman who has come to my notice this past winter, a Mademoiselle Lacaze, a niece of the Comtesse de Sourges, who would, by all accounts, be of considerable use to the household, and who is at present available for placement. She has the reflex by the Comtesse's report which I trust. She is 23. I am proposing that we bring her into your part of the work, not as a replacement for you. You are entirely irreplaceable in the senior role, but as your junior, to be trained by you across the coming quieter years, against the time when the work resumes, as it will resume eventually, in some form, perhaps with my husband, perhaps with son who is now 19, and who will, I have no illusions, present his own variations of these difficulties in due course. I am proposing this, not only for the campaign's sake, but for your sake, Vaury, because I think the having of a junior to train will give you some of the structure you are missing in the quieter period, and because I think the training of a young woman in this work will be a useful occupation for the part of you that has until now found its occupation in the work itself, and because I think, frankly, you will be good at it in a way that few would, and that this is a use of your gifts that the household has not yet asked you to exercise, and that the asking is now timely. You would have her in the writing room beside you during the morning hours. You would assign her work as the cases require, and you would, in the evenings of the quieter months, perhaps occasionally have her to your flat for the kind of supper at which one woman teaches a younger woman what the work actually is. In plain words, which Madame Charpentier did for me when I was 24 and frightened, and have done for no one since, because the household has not had the right young woman for me to do it for, and I think Mademoiselle Lacaze might be that woman, and I think you might be, for her, what Madame Charpentier was for me. And I think the doing of it, Vaury, would warm the narrow house you have been moving into without intending to, would put a chair at the kitchen table, would give you, in the simplest practical terms, a person to talk to in plain words about the work, which I cannot fully be for you because I am the Queen, and which Madame Charpentier was for me but is no longer for either of us, and which a younger junior could become, by the proper cultivation across the years. That is the suggestion. You may take a week to consider it. I am not asking for an answer today. Madeleine took the week, and she walked in the spring afternoons in the public parks near her flat, alone, and she considered the suggestion, not as the household offer it had been presented, as but as the larger thing it was, the offer of a way of arranging her remaining decades, that would not be the narrow house alone, and she found, in the considering, that she was both deeply grateful to the Queen for having seen the narrow house from across the writing room, when Madeleine had not yet quite seen it herself, and deeply rueful that the seeing had had to come from the Queen, that Madeleine had not, in 14 years of cultivating her own competence at the work, cultivated any equivalent attention to her own life, that the Queen, who was busier and more constrained than Madeleine by every measure, had none the less been more attentive to Madeleine's life than Madeleine herself had been, and that this asymmetry, painful as it was to recognize, was itself part of what the Queen had been warning her about, that the work made the woman who did it well into a person less able to attend to her own life precisely because she was attending so well to the work, and that the only correction was to introduce, deliberately, into the life the kind of structure the work no longer provided, and that the Queen's suggestion of Mademoiselle Lacaze was such a structure, gently offered, and that Madeleine would be a fool, at 37, to refuse it on any grounds of professional pride, because professional pride at 37, in a woman in Madeleine's situation, was simply the narrow house's wallpaper. Madeleine accepted at the end of the week, and Mademoiselle Lacaze, who proved to be Anne-Sophie Lacaze, a quiet, thin, clever girl, with a face that gave nothing and eyes that took in everything, arrived in the writing room on a Monday morning in May 1973, and was introduced to the work, and was, across the next 4 years, slowly, patiently, in the writing room by morning and over the suppers in Madeleine's flat by evening, brought into the second conversation, taught the reflex, given the ledger in increments, shown the operational files, walked through the Vasari and Vondril cases as historical examples, prepared against the day when the work would resume and she would need to be fully ready. And Madeleine, in the doing of all this, found that the Queen had been more right than she had perhaps known, that the having of Anne-Sophie at the table did warm the narrow house in the small daily ways such warmings happen, that the conversations over the supper plates about the day's small matters became, by slow accretion, the kind of conversations that constitute, when looked back at, an actual companionship, that Anne-Sophie, who was unmarried also, and who was, the Comtesse de Sourges had hinted, likely to remain so for reasons not unconnected to her own quietness, began to spend a great deal of her free time at Madeleine's flat, in a manner that was not entirely professional, and was not entirely social, and was something quieter and more permanent, the kind of friendship between two women separated by 14 years that is structured by the senior protecting and instructing the junior in the early years, and that, if both women have the necessary qualities, evolves, in the later years, into the more equal companionship of two veterans of the same work. And Madeleine, in 1973 and 1974 and 1975, watching Anne-Sophie grow into the work, recognized that the Queen had given her, in the offer of a junior, not only an apprentice, but a successor of the kind Madame Charpentier had been, at 35, to a 60-year-old version of herself, and that this lineage of women, working in the writing room of the Queens of Estavia across the generations, the Charpentiers to the Vaurys to the Lacazes, was a structure the Queen had been quietly building into the household for her own reasons, but had also, in giving Madeleine a place in it, given Madeleine a continuity her own family life had never quite provided, and that this continuity was itself one of the unspoken compensations of the work, that the women of the writing room were each other's family, in a way that the official family lives of the kingdom did not formally recognize, that Madame Charpentier, who had retired in 1971 and had died in 1976 in a small house in the country attended by Madeleine in the last weeks, had been by the end more nearly Madeleine's actual professional mother than Madeleine's actual mother had been in the provinces, that Madeleine would, in time, be such a mother to Anne-Sophie, that Anne-Sophie would in turn be such a mother to whoever followed her, and that this chain of professional mothers and daughters, conducted in the writing room across decades, was the household's true inheritance, the line that went on regardless of the male succession of the kingdom, and that the Queen had been, in the spring of 1973, quietly placing Madeleine into the chain, not as a kindness but as a sovereign act of architecture. The way one places a stone in a wall one is building for the long centuries. Anne-Sophie was, by 1977, fully formed in the work, and was, by 1980, almost ready to take the principal seat if Madeleine had to be away, and was, 1983, when she was 33 and Madeleine was 47, the kind of junior that one no longer needs to monitor, that one simply trusts to do the work and to come for guidance only on the rare cases that exceed her training. And the years of her formation were, in retrospect, the years in which Madeleine herself most fully became the woman she would be for the rest of her life, the senior keeper of the household, the woman with the reflex more deeply than anyone in the kingdom save the Queen herself, the woman who could draft a letter in her sleep that managed an entire situation, the woman who, in 1981, on the death of the Comte de Lassay in his retirement, was given charge of the senior secretariat's strategic correspondence as well, the household having by then decided that no separate senior secretary was needed if Vaury could be given the additional brief and a deputy of her choosing, and Vaury had chosen Anne-Sophie as the deputy, and the office had been consolidated, and Madeleine had become, by 1982, at the age of 46, the most powerful private servant of the crown in the kingdom. and almost no one outside the household knew her name, which was the achievement of her life, and the proof of how completely the household had succeeded in its work, that the woman who held more practical knowledge of the kingdom's private affairs than anyone alive, save Sophia herself, could walk in the streets of the capital and never be recognized, and Madeleine, walking in those streets on her quiet afternoons in the early 1980s, in her plain dark coat, with her plain dark face, found that the not being recognized was now her deepest professional pleasure, that she had passed, somewhere in the considering years, from caring about being known to enjoying not being known, and that this transformation, which the Queen had foretold in 1959, and which Madame Charpentier had foretold even earlier, was complete in her, and was not, it turned out, the loss she had feared at 23, but a particular kind of liberation, the liberation of a person who had so thoroughly internalized the work, that the work was no longer a discipline, but the structure of her freedom, that she did the work because the work was now what she was, and was, accordingly, not constrained by it, was, in fact, the freest woman she knew. And in this stretch of years, in the long quiet 80s, with Anne-Sophie in the deputy's chair and the prince consort settled into a manageable middle age, and Madame Vaury concluded in 1977 by her own quiet departure from the affair. Having decided, after 11 years of philosophy letters from the Queen, that she would return to her husband in the Northern Post and read more, which had been the campaign's secret hope and had been delivered to the campaign as a quiet victory of the third part of the ledger, the parallel campaign, and Mademoiselle Bauer, raising her children in Lausanne and writing once a year to the Queen with news of small ordinary things, and the Queen replying once a year with the same. In this stretch of years the household entered its golden middle period, the period in which the work was running so smoothly that Madeleine had time, for the first time in her professional life, to look up, and she looked up, and she looked at the third woman, the one we have been waiting to come into this telling, the woman who was the saddest case of the whole 38 years, the innocent younger woman who paid the same price for nothing, and the way Madeleine came to look at her properly, and the small belated work the household tried to do for her, and the failure of that work, are the substance of the part that follows. Her name was Léonie Renard, and she was 28 years old in the autumn of 1984, when the household first became aware that the kingdom had begun to consider her one of the prince consort's women, and she was not, had never been, would never be, and the not being was the whole of her tragedy, and it was the tragedy the household watched unfold over the following 2 years without being able to prevent it, and the watching was, for Madeleine, the hardest professional experience of her long career, because it was the one case in which the campaign's accumulated wisdom proved actively useless, in which the household's instruments, designed for the management of women who were in fact mistresses of the prince consort, could not be applied to a woman who was not, because to apply them would have been to confirm the rumour and to deepen the injury. And the household, watching her decline, found itself in the position of a great hospital that has the medicines for one disease, watching a patient die of another, knowing the medicines on its shelves, and knowing they cannot help, and being unable to provide any alternative, and the inability was the hardest single thing Madeleine wrote about in the manuscript at 90, because it was the one place where the household's competence had not been competence enough, and where the cost had been paid entirely by a young woman who had done nothing to incur it, and where Madeleine had to acknowledge, at the end of her life, that the campaign she had spent her career running had cast a shadow long enough to fall on a stranger's life and ruin it without ever having intended to touch her at all, and that the unintended ruin was, in some moral arithmetic she could not quite reconcile herself to, the household's responsibility nonetheless, that the campaign was the cause, and the campaign must own the cost, and that the household had not, in the case of Léonie Renard, owned it sufficiently, had not even, perhaps, owned it at all in the way the matter deserved. Léonie Renard was the daughter of a provincial physician, had come to the capital at 20 to study at the Academy of Fine Arts, had stayed on after her studies as a junior cataloguer at the Royal Galleries, and had, in the spring of 1984, at the age of 28, been assigned to assist the curator of the Royal Collections in preparing an exhibition of 17th-century portraiture that the prince consort, in one of his periodic enthusiasms for the cultural patronage that the Queen had long encouraged him to take up as a substitute for less manageable interests, had agreed to lend his name to as honorary chairman. This involved, in the routine course of such things, perhaps 4 or 5 meetings between the prince and the junior cataloguer over a period of 2 months, all of them in the presence of the curator, all of them concerning the catalogue and the hanging and the wall texts, all of them entirely professional. And Léonie Renard had been, in those meetings, by the curator's later account, exactly what she always was in such situations, a careful, clever young woman with a serious mind and a quiet manner, who took her work seriously and did not flirt and did not, in any way the curator could detect, register the prince consort as anything other than the prince consort, the honorary chairman, a man twice her age whose name was lent to her project. What had happened, in the small everyday way these things happen, was that one of the meetings, the third, had run long, and the curator had been called away halfway through, and Mademoiselle Renard and the prince had spent perhaps 40 minutes alone in the office of the chief curator, going through the proofs of the catalogue introduction. And a junior member of the gallery staff, walking past the open door, had seen the two of them at the desk together, the prince leaning over the page, and Mademoiselle Renard pointing to a line of the text, and had registered, without thinking anything of it at the time, the small ordinary tableau of a senior man and a junior woman working together on a document, and had walked on, and had, some days later, in the way such things move in such institutions, mentioned the tableau in passing to a colleague, and the colleague had mentioned it to another, and by the time the story had been told and retold across the gallery 3 times, the small ordinary tableau had become a small remarkable scene, the prince consort alone with the young cataloguer behind a closed door, and by the time the scene had been told outside the gallery, at a dinner in the city in the early summer of 1984, it had become a confidential bit of insider knowledge about the prince's current entanglement, and by the autumn of 1984, when the exhibition opened and Mademoiselle Renard attended the opening reception in her one good dress, and was photographed in the press, in the routine group photograph of the curatorial team, standing beside the prince consort and the queen, the kingdom that read the society pages had already, on the strength of the dinner table rumour, decided that the slim, quiet, dark-haired young woman, 3 places to the prince's left in the photograph, was the latest one, and Léonie Renard had walked into the opening reception in her one good dress, not knowing that she had, in the months since the 3rd curatorial meeting, become a public figure of a kind she had never sought to be and was not equipped to manage, and had stood in the reception line for 2 hours being looked at by everyone in the room with the particular sideways look that the kingdom by now applied automatically to any woman seen alone with the prince consort for longer than 5 minutes, and had gone home that night to her small flat near the gallery, and had wondered, the curator told Madeleine later, why so many people at the reception had been so strange to her, and had concluded, charitably, that she had perhaps worn the wrong sort of dress. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.